Thank you for joining us this morning for the Oregon State Board of Agriculture meeting. Today is Friday, March 14th. This is Elin Miller, Chair of the Board. This meeting is now called to order. Note that public comment is scheduled today at 10. If you would like to provide verbal comments this morning, please make a request using the chat box, including your name and organization, or if you're here in the room, to please go ahead and sign up on the sign-up sheet. This meeting is being recorded, and board members and guests, please do state your name for the record in advance of your comments. I'd like to begin by asking Department of Agriculture Board Committee Coordinator Carla Valness, actually for her last day, and we really have appreciated all her work over the years, and she's going on to bigger and brighter things than having to deal with us. So Carla, I just wanted to formally say that for the record.
Thank you.
But Carla will review our housekeeping items for the meeting. Carla.
Good morning. Just a reminder to please mute your phones and computer audio during the call to prevent any unnecessary background. We also requested only board members and presenters turn on your camera during the call. And if you are joining by conference call, pre-meeting materials are available on the ODA website at odadirect/board agriculture, or items will be posted after the meeting. And again, just a reminder, this meeting is being recorded.
All right, thank you, Carla. Will you please call the roll for introductions? I'll begin. Elin Miller, Farmer Umpqua.
Chad Allen is joining later. Barbara Boyer is excused. Brian Harper is excused. Ty Kluwer.
Ty Cleaver, Klamath Falls, Farmer Rancher Brewer. Thank you for everything, Carla.
Miguel Lopez is joining a little later this morning. Kirk Mogg is excused. Ellie Norris.
Ellie Norris, Farmer, Douglas County.
Eric Orem.
Good morning, Eric Orem, Farmer from Heppner, and thank you, Carla, for everything.
Josh Zielinski is not attending. Dean Simonich.
Stacy Simonich, Dean of Oregon State University's College of Agricultural Sciences and Director of the Oregon Agricultural Experiment Station, and thank you so much, Carla.
Yeah, you're welcome. Director Sharplow Hansen.
Good morning, Lisa Sharplow Hansen, Director, Oregon Department of Agriculture.
Again, if we have any folks online, we'd like to ask you to please sign in using the chat box, and I'll go around the room quickly. Isaac will start.
Isaac Stapleton, Department of Ag.
Stone Sanda, Department of Ag.
Chris Meneman, Department of Ag.
Rusty Rock, Department of Ag.
Crystal Brunel, Oregon Water Resources Department.
All right. Thank you, Carla. First up on our agenda is the long-awaited viewing of our commercial that was produced, and the team worked yesterday to make sure we would be able to see it this morning, so I will turn it over to you guys for the drum roll and debut.
The unveiling.
Oregon's agriculture is more than the fields we work. It's the heartbeat of our economy, our culture, and our way of life. It connects us all from farm to table with hundreds of products grown, caught, and raised. Family farms and hard-working people shape our fields, our fisheries, and our pastures. So, support Oregon agriculture when you shop and when you dine. Choose local, choose Oregon.
Nice.
Woo! Great. That was worth the wait. That was worth the wait. So a good way to start off the day, too. In addition to a wonderful report, we're going to be hearing from Dean Simonich. So, Stacey, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. So good to be here today and with all of you. Maybe I'll just highlight some of the things that have been going on. In terms of the college, things are great in the college with record high enrollment. Up to this point, record high research. A lot of uncertainty, as we've talked about more and more at this meeting. About a month ago, I was in Washington, D.C. with the Association of Public and Land-Grant University Deans of College of Agricultural Sciences across the country, which of course our college is a part of. And it just so happened that it overlapped with Director Hansen's meeting and some other meetings that were going on. So we were able to meet up just casually, and so that was good. So while I was there with the other deans of agriculture across the country, we were on Capitol Hill all together talking about agricultural research in the U.S. and how we're losing ground and the importance of it, meeting with the Oregon delegation. Also on our side, also from a Farm Bill perspective, because I'm the chair of the Farm Bill Committee for that group. I think Lisa or Director Hansen summed it up really well. No matter if you were a Democrat or Republican on the Hill, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of confusion, and a general lack of information. And I experienced that in many cases. Legislators and their staff were asking OSU for the information that we had, especially around the USDA Ag Research Service firings that took place on Valentine's Day. So we've been working hard to track that, the USDA Ag Research Service firings across the state. Those took place in Corvallis, in Newport, in Hood River, in Pendleton, and in Burns. And our college is co-located with those USDA ARS employees. And many of those employees that were fired were graduates of Oregon State, were certainly collaborators of Oregon State, helped us mentor our graduate students, helped us conduct research all over the state. So we work very collaboratively with USDA ARS within Oregon. About 22 folks were fired. To date, we've gotten 7 or 8 of those back in large part due to also the support of Oregon's farmers and ranchers. And now we'll see with some of the pending lawsuits, et cetera, if we get all of those folks back. But to date, we have about 7 or 8 of those 22 fired. At one point, there was no one in Newport working for USDA ARS shellfish breeding program. So that was pretty dire for, aquaculture shellfish folks on the coast. So very fast-paced, very uncertain day to day. On the other side of this is the research funding for both Oregon State University and for the college. We've made great strides in the past 4 or 5 years, basically tripling our research dollars coming into the state and into the college in OSU. Last year, the College of Agricultural Sciences made up about 30% of OSU's research expenditures, and that's right up there with the College of Engineering. And so of our $110 million in research funding in the college last year, about 60% of that was competitive federally funded research that you get by writing grants. And so about 60% of that 110 was federally received. It included USDA, NIH, NSF, DOE, DOD, and US EPA. And you might think, USDA is a big part of that for our college, but we're actually the college likely with the highest NIH funding at OSU because our college is so broad and food is medicine, right? So all cuts to all of these agencies impact us. So we have had a handful of stop work orders on a handful of grants. We're working through that. Hard to know if they'll be reinstated or not. So a lot of uncertainty for our folks and for us financially. On the indirect cost side, you've seen a proposal executive order early on to cut the indirect costs for National Institutes of Health to 15%. That would take about an $8 million cut just out of the college. So I think there's a lot of misperceptions about indirect costs. It's really what we use to maintain our experiment stations across the state. You know, we have experiment stations in 13 locations all over the state, all the way from the coast to the border with Idaho, Portland, all the way south. So these indirect costs are not fluff money. They're pretty seriously, they are seriously used for infrastructure. And anyone who's been to one of our experiment stations knows that they're not ideal in terms of infrastructure. But without that money, we couldn't have all those locations across the state. And so, of course, there's a fear that those cuts to indirect costs could also move to NSF, to USDA, et cetera. So I think there's an injunction now to hold that, but you know, that's a significant amount of money for both the college and for OSU. Not sure what we would do if that happened. Might be forced to have to close some of our experiment stations because we wouldn't have the funds to support them in their maintenance. The other side is on our research with USDA ARS. We have other grant funding that we share with USDA ARS scientists. Some of that is called a NACA, Non-Assistance Cooperative Agreement, or an RSA that supports graduate students' research support agreement. We are fearful that those NACAs and RSAs with USDA ARS scientists will go away. And so that would be a cut of about $11.2 million to the college. So, yes, we're all figuring out how to navigate, how to take care of ourselves and each other, and, you know, a lot of fear and anxiety that I'm seeing. The last thing to talk about is in tab 9 of our books, and you see it here on the screen. And I think I've talked about this, shared a little bit about this as in our last meeting, but this is a summary of House Bill 2408 that Bobby Levy is putting forward. It's about it's the House bill to support the Oregon statewide public service programs, and that includes agricultural research, OSU Extension, and the Forest Research Lab within the College of Forestry. And so this document walks through what our 23-25 legislatively approved budget was in the table, what we calculate continuing service level increase to be, and then we're asking for additional $6 million for the biennium in other positions, which is on the other side. So you see our total request is an increase of, a total is $207.2 million total is the request. And if you look on the other side or the other page, that $6 million in new funding for the biennium, $3 million a year, is outlined how we would use that on the back. I think now more than ever, we need to get applied economists out in the state, shared between experiment stations. This would generally be a bachelor's level or a master's level person to help farmers and ranchers and researchers navigate all of the economic uncertainty right now. Sometimes when I'm out in the field or at field days, I see our researchers researching something, very excited about it, that's not economically feasible, and they did not know that, right? So this would help bridge that gap. And then there is some funding in here for some research support for the wheat, grass seed, and hazelnut industries. I think that's about $1 million. Viticulture extension position in the Willamette Valley. They've asked for that position for a long time. We've only had about 0.2 or 0.3 FTE in viticulture extension, so we need to get that out into the Willamette Valley. The College of Forestry section is next, and then other positions that we're interested in filling. I would just point out that the agrivoltaic community engagement position is not an advocate for agrivoltaics. It's a position to help navigate, and I think we're going to be talking more about this later today, agrivoltaics. Where does it make sense? What type of land? Where? What crops, right? Not advocating for it one way or another, but helping our folks navigate that and where it makes sense and where it doesn't. So thanks for your support of Oregon State University and the college, and appreciate all of you.
Thank you, and thank you for being resilient and navigating through all the uncertainty and more uncertainty to come. I want to be a positive person in how things are going to turn out. But thank you for your leadership there and leadership for Oregon nationally on the Farm Bill, which is obviously critical as we go forward. Any questions of Dean Director Simonich?
Not a question, but just a comment. I really appreciate the partnership that OSU and ODA are working on continuing to develop and grow. Dean Simonich has been incredibly helpful in connecting us with the right people to try and include the right people in the right places for projects we're working on. The regulation's hard. And there are lots of different perspectives around it. And so trying to bring the right people to the table from the OSU perspective to help us make progress has been incredibly helpful. So thank you so much for your partnership, Stacy.
Thank you.
It's great. All right, let's go ahead and move on to ODA Plant Protection and Conservation Division. Chris, would you join us? And again, it's nice that we're going to have a deep dive today into everything that you, not everything, but a lot.
Not doing it all, I promise.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to set a timer here to try to keep myself honest. So good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chair Miller and Director Sharpelo-Hansen, members of the board, and everyone joining us online and in the room. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come here today and give you an overview of our division of plant protection, or we call it PLANT for short because it is a mouthful. So next slide, please. So I thought it would be appropriate to kind of start, because I didn't really know how to start exactly, but I think most of you hopefully are familiar with this infographic. Apologies if it's a little small if you can't see it. But kind of I was looking at this and I thought, you know, out of the 5 programs in my division, we touch on at least over 50% of these commodities in some way or another. So it may be direct, such as, you know, the Christmas tree program or nursery program or our hemp program, where we have entire programs dedicated to a particular commodity. It might be indirectly, where we're in partnership or solely conducting a survey for some kind of crop protection or doing some kind of market access work. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I actually hadn't really thought about that too much before until I looked at that. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we have 5 programs in the division: hemp, IPPM, native plant, noxious weeds, and nursery. The ones with the asterisk, I put that there just to highlight. These are the 3 programs in particular that lean heavily on partnerships with other entities, whether that's state, local, or federal. The other 2 programs are license fee supported, so they're kind of a little bit more secure in that regard. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that we are, as a management team of the program, we're relatively new. Most of us have not been in our roles for very long, so that's been a part of that process and getting us molded together and working together as a team. But I think we're in good space for that. So happy to report that. So first, hemp. I will say I do welcome questions along the way. So I'm kind of going through each program, but if we want to keep questions sectored into the by program area, that'd be great. So welcome to do that. So hemp, like I mentioned, is a other funded program. So we are responsible for licensing, grow operations, handlers. We do touch on seed producers and vendors. Kind of the nut and bolts of this program is compliance. We really are trying to ensure that this industry is operating in a legal way that's compliant with both state and federal regulations, and teasing apart, you know, what's hemp and what's not hemp. Next slide, please. So just a quick hemp 101, you know, really what is the difference? These are, biologically speaking, the same plant, right? But really when we're looking at it, we're trying to pay attention to, are the THC levels, you know, which is the primary component in the plant that, you know, will make you high, right? That has those effects that some folks are looking out for. You know, is it below the threshold or not? And so 0.3% is that THC threshold that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So historically, the 2 primary categories that we've been licensing are growers versus handlers. And kind of simply speaking, growers, as the name implies, those are the producers that are growing, whether in field or in greenhouses, growing hemp, whereas handlers are taking that product and then changing that into the final product, which will then be produced as hemp and then producing CBD is the primary outcome of the products that we're producing. Both licenses require a land use compatibility statement to make sure that within their jurisdictions, whether city or county, that they are operating legally and can actually have those facilities up and running in those areas. And the grower also requires the background check, which we do want to do to make sure that folks aren't having a criminal record, and we do look about 10 years prior for that. So all of that is a lot of administrative work, and we are following up with inspections as well. Next slide, please. New to last year, we did add another license type, I should say, in July. This is our vendor license, and this can apply to all products that are containing CBD for mostly consumption, so CBD gummies or CBD drinks. And this is a pretty wide spanning license in that it's really going to touch on any retailer. So that could be that quickie market, your gas station, the Fred Meyer, any other kind of retail operation. So we did acknowledge that this was maybe going to be a sticking point for the industry and we're requiring another license. However, we did take into consideration that a lot of these businesses, such as ones that have a food safety license, for example, are also having to now track another license, but we were trying to keep those on track. So we were knowing, okay, this is your time of year to renew this license. So hopefully to try to reduce the burden on that. Next slide, please. So really the impetus for wanting to have this license was this was a sector that was not formally had any kind of oversight over. And so we saw that as a huge, huge problem. And then looking across the country, we were one of states with hemp as a legal industry, but we weren't overseeing this particular sector of the industry. So we wanted to, make sure we had an avenue for ensuring regulatory compliance was a huge thing. Tracking and traceability also was a huge thing, which was also kind of a part of compliance with House Bill 3000. So we could be able to track from source to product. So that was also part of that process. And then again, ultimately, consumer protection is something that we're concerned about. So making sure the product that you're buying on the shelf is exactly what it is. And so that all kind of ties together for why we wanted to be able to have this license. A lot of numbers on this next slide, but I think the reason I wanted to share this was because one of the number one questions that we have is, how is the industry doing as a whole, knowing that it was once a very booming industry. So back in 2019, 2020, numbers were up. And we have seen a significant downturn in those numbers in terms of number of licensures, number of acres being farmed, have gone down. And full disclosure, there was a couple years that we were a little nervous about what that was going to mean for the department in terms of the health and stability of the program. I think I am happy to say that we are seeing those numbers level out, and the budget, at least within this program, looks good. So we are able to support our staff and keep continuing providing the services that we need to for the industry that is up and running. Last slide for kind of hemp is, so the way we split up the state, much like most of our programs, we're looking at regions. So we have our southeastern, Salem, northwest, and eastern central. And I will point out, we only have 4 hemp inspectors for all of this work. But again, we only have a couple hundred licensures, so it is doable as long as we're keeping on a good track and making sure that we're getting through those workloads in a timely manner. Main thing I wanted to highlight with this report is looking at we are able to actually visit a lot of these facilities, which is something historically we could not do because we didn't have the capacity and there were just so many licenses out there that needed our attention. That compounded with the issues we were having with the legal marijuana grows and the partnership with OLCC that we tie into with a lot of the work that we're doing. It just took so much time that we weren't able to get to anyone. So I am happy to say that I think we are in a much better place and able to really have those touch points with those growers, making sure that they are compliant, getting the appropriate testing that they need, and having that outreach and education component that we really weren't able to invest in before. So if there are any questions on that, Chair Miller.
Any questions or comments? Yes, a question. Elon Miller for the record. So thank you for providing the numbers because we just hear that, hey, such a dramatic change in the industry from where it was. But I also look at those numbers too. How many do you feel are, and the issue of people calling themselves a hemp grower and it not really being real, and a lot of the investigations and all the money that's gone into hopefully enforcement and all those kinds of things, then the partnership with OLCC. Would some of those numbers be the illegitimate hemp numbers when you talk about the higher numbers back in 2019, 2020, et
Yes.
cetera? And again, health of the true industry versus the folks wanting to use this as a reason to have an illegal grow.
Sure. Thank you for that. So I'll admit I don't have the exact numbers for you, but I think
Ballpark.
just on a whole, it's on a downturn collectively. So we are seeing more legitimate growers there. So even though we do have folks that are maybe not compliant, so just on the chart, there's references to presumptive marijuana and that they failed. That just means that, they did have a certain percentage of their crop that didn't meet that standard of saying that it was cannabis. We do allow a certain percent of that to be there with a certain amount of destruction required, but without having them to destroy all of their crop, versus saying that you failed completely, which means that too much of your crop did not pass muster.
Yeah.
So we're seeing less of that.
Well, I was actually looking back to the slide before, if we could go back one. It was just that the top numbers, one more back, yeah. Just, how many growers and how many, again, not so much necessarily the industry. Again, we need to look at the viability of the industry going forward, which you've said is flattened out. But I would assume maybe some of those numbers were related to some of these other issues, and given the fact that we've got a regulatory infrastructure from you and OLCC,
Right.
that's also influenced. That was the question of.
Sure. And unfortunately, I don't have an actual number to say exactly where we're at with that, other than to say that that percentage is down.
All right. Okay. All right. Moving on.
All right. So on to insects. So insect pest prevention and management is the largest program in our division, with this permanent staff of just under 20, and that fluctuates up to about 30, maybe to 40 once we onboard our seasonal staff. Kind of the nuts and bolts of what we're doing in this program, I would say, really centers around survey. So we're looking for, unwanted pests or invasive species that are coming into the state, ones that have already established or are in near edge of establishment. And one of the key things that we do is providing identification services. So we are very fortunate to have a very strong team of highly trained entomologists that can do that. Many of them are specialists in their field for particular species of insects. And so we're providing that service both for our own programs. We do this regionally, we do this nationally. So that's a huge benefit of a resource we have here in Oregon. So I have 3 different things I want to talk about. So the first one I'm going to start with is Mediterranean oak borer. This is a pest that is new to Oregon. This came online actually while emerald ash borer was still very much new in Oregon. And so unfortunately, shortly after EAB came online, we discovered that we also had this other pest of native trees, and it kind of fell under the radar. Not necessarily that we weren't working on it, it just did not catch on in the media attention, and more broadly speaking in the state. So I did want to highlight this. This was a wood-boring pest. It attacks native oaks. So in Oregon, we're specifically talking about Oregon white oak, which is already having a lot of problems with the diminishing habitat. So this is just another insult to injury. In California, it was first found in 2019 in the Napa Valley area, where they also have several species of native oaks. We had found it just once here or there historically, but in 2023, that's when we were actually finding live infested dead dying trees in the Sandy and Wilsonville, Oregon. So this is where we knew we were having established populations. So I did have the opportunity in 2023 to go visit some of the sites where the city of Wilsonville had detected Mediterranean oak borer or mob. And they had about 30 trees that they found infested. And so they felled them all. We were able to go over there with our partners at Department of Forestry and go scouting through these trees to see if we could find individuals to take back for identification. So just for a scale reference, these are extremely tiny, tiny, tiny little beetles. You cannot identify them with the naked eye, so they really have to be looked at with a microscope. And our entomologists, Joshua Vlach and Tom Valenti, are both specialists in wood borers in particular, so they were able to easily identify and confirm that these were Mediterranean oak borer. And I will note that these particular type of beetles, ambrosia beetles, they're not the ones actually killing the tree. They will attack trees that are stressed out as they create their galleries, as they're burrowing through the tree. They're carrying a fungus that then is what ultimately is killing the tree. So it does cause a vascular wilt disease, which is ultimately what causes tree death. And I think it's important to kind of note, most cases when we have these new invasive species, we don't know how they're arriving. We're typically not intercepting these upon arrival. It's always, in retrospect, we have to consider what are the pathways. When it comes to wood borers in particular, we usually think about logs as being the way, or firewood as the way that these species are getting around. In this particular case, we knew from some research that we had done that these beetles did not come from California, although that's where they were first detected in the United States. It was a different population that we know that came from, is more closely related to those found in Germany. So knowing that, we feel that it's a good, safe bet that it could be wine staves or wine barrels is how these things are getting around, because due to international phytosanitary requirements, staves and wine barrels are not required to go through heat treatment process. So we have been talking about pathway analysis with our partners at USDA APHIS Plant Protection Quarantine, and this is one of the points that I've brought up, is that seems to be a pretty big loophole in the regulations and requirements. So we'll see. Next slide, please. Really quickly, this is just kind of where we're finding Mediterranean oak borer. So we did receive funding from our partners at U.S. Forest Service. We've done 2 years of statewide survey, most of that work being centered. We are focusing in Southern Oregon, although we haven't found any in Southern Oregon, fortunately. So most of our detections have been in the northern part of the state. It's a little hard to see, but there are purple and green dots which differentiate between the 2 years and the results of our surveys. Just focusing on 2024, we did find several live beetles in 3 different counties. And collectively, we have surveyed 6 counties, finding an additional about 760 additional beetles. And for 2025, we will continue to use up the remaining of those Forest Service funds to continue survey for this year. No additional funding is anticipated after this. So this will be our last year of conducting survey. And after that, we will be passing on the baton onto our partners to continue efforts on research or any other kind of localized survey that they are able to do. Next slide, please. All right. Vine mealybug, we have mentioned this a couple times up until now. And again, this is a pest of grapevines. It actually has a wider host than beyond grape, but we do focus primarily on grapevines. It is a quarantine pest by the Department of Ag, but it got here somehow, which again, we don't really know, but it could have been likely through the introduction of infested grapevine material. One of the key reasons we're concerned about this particular pest is that it not only reduces plant vigor of grapevines, but it also is a vector for various leaf roll viruses, which are also already a concern to the industry. And we have not been able to do surveys to detect if we're also finding the leaf roll viruses here in Oregon, other than we have been surveying for this particular pest. Next slide, please. There's a lot of text here, but I think the primary takeaway here is that we were first detecting this in 2021, and it was actually the Oregon State University Southern Oregon Research Center that actually first found vine mealybug and notified ODA, so we appreciate that communication on that. In 2021 in Jackson County, and then through partnerships, being able to continue to acquire funding, both through the Oregon Wine Board and through state funding, able to continue to do additional surveys, which after a couple of years, we were realizing that we were finding it in 3 different counties across the state. At first, we thought this was a localized incidence in Southern Oregon, but then finding the detection up in Linn County, that kind of gave us a hint that, this could be more widespread than we possibly thought. And that was definitely of a concern for the Northern Willamette Valley wine industry in particular. Since this is a quarantine pest in Oregon, we did have to implement small localized quarantines on any property that was found to be infested, which ultimately was just asking them to do treatments, take safeguarding measures for how they were destroying any plant material or removing plant material from their property in order to try to limit the burden of those quarantines as much as possible. In general, those vineyards were very cooperative on that. Next slide. So in 2024, we did do a statewide survey, and we were able to get a pretty healthy look across 16 different counties. So again, we appreciate the cooperation from the industry and able to do that. When I say localized trapping, that really means that we were targeting those properties that were infested before. So we were able to go back, relook at those properties and see, are we finding more vine mealybug at those particular locations. You'll notice that in Linn County, there was those 222 vine mealybug were on or around one particular location that we were having some discussions with that particular property owner about treatment. So that's why those numbers are a little high. The treatment reimbursement program, I do want to mention really quick, that was something that we typically do not do, but through that state funding, we were able to offer that, and that was really great. And I glossed over it quickly before. Oregon State University was also really key in helping us accomplish and achieving these funds, so thank you for that. And they also were able to work with industry in Southern Oregon in order to provide free treatment for some of the growers down there as well. So we only have funding through the end of June, so we'll continue doing what we can and doing our surveys. We will not be able to afford to provide any kind of reimbursement, so we will continue to encourage growers to treat as much as possible and trying to focus on those areas that have already had vine mealybug detected at those sites. Gonna go over. Okay. Chair Miller.
Yes. Any questions? Sorry, this is an area that
This is rapid gunfire. There's a lot of information.
Elin Miller for the record. So appreciate the cooperation, particularly OSU and the Department of Ag, and helping getting the funding through, as well as obviously making all that happen. I guess my question is, from a treatment standpoint, a lot of tools have been lost, no longer registered. Is there really a viable treatment that you're confident in?
There is. So
I've heard there isn't, but
for this one in particular, I apologize, I can't remember the name of the chemistries, but there is a mating disruptor that we have found to be very effective. So really, it's a kind of a combination of doing more traditional treatment on top of a mating disruptor methodology, which we have seen success because there are some properties that are doing both of those. And so if we can get that kind of a program working, then that seems to be what does work. And that has been found to be successful.
And that can be very preventative.
Correct.
And in advance of, but if you've got a major infestation, that's going to do nothing for you.
Well, I mean, as with both of these things, early detection is really a part of it. And so that's where we're trying to encourage, getting your staff trained. So the folks in the field who can find these things early and get those kind of treatment programs implemented early on is really going to be your best bet. Because you're right, once these infestations do get high enough, it is very difficult.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the hot spots to deal with those immediately, and if there could be emergency exemption sort of thing for, anyway, it was just a thought because, yeah.
Chair Lopez, did you have a question?
Yeah, Miguel Lopez for the record. Going all the way back to MOB. Oh my goodness, it just escaped my mind. All right, I'll hop back to vine mealybug. Yeah, it's a cyclical component in the vine mealybug cycle. So you have a mass population, you start knocking it back. It takes a few cycles, a few seasons to get through it. And that was my curiosity. You asked that question because I had the same curiosity of are we going to see a decrease positive performance here with what we're doing, and it sounds like we are. I guess now it's up to us as that ag sector to keep on top of it, along with the discovery of mob. My question about mob was, are we seeing it more in? I was looking at the map that you had here presented for us, and for the most part, the locations that you found it in were more urban and less out in, lack of better words, wine country. So I'm just wondering if most of these that are showing up on stuff that we're finding at your local garden stores, chopped up barrels that are for sale, or transportation. I look at East Portland, Clackamas, Troutdale area. I feel like that's like more of a transportation hub, and things show up, get chopped up, and sold back out into the world as vine barrel planters.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. So typically when we're doing our surveys, we are looking for pathways and points of introduction that are likely. And one, we do have a lot in those areas because that's where our preliminary trapping had kind of informed where we should do follow-up trapping, so that we're always following those leads of where we have. So we're not usually randomly just putting a trap here and there unless we really need to. And early on, I can't remember how far back, it might have been that 2018 detection. The initial Mediterranean oak borer specimen that we found was associated with the nursery because they had received some sort of wood product that had been hanging out on their property for some amount of time. We had set a trap there just randomly as a part of another survey, and then that's where we caught that up. So we were acknowledging that, you know, those areas could also be pathways in addition to wine growing operations. So. Go ahead.
Ellie Norris, for the record. I actually have two questions for you. First one, is there a treatment for oak wilt fungus at this point?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And then for the vine mealybug, is that just in vineyards, or are you seeing that in any other crops?
That's also a good question. So vine mealybug, although grape is the primary host that we talk about, it actually has a very wide host range, and it can feed off of about 100 different species of plants. So I didn't say that in the survey, but we were not only targeting vineyards, but we were also targeting just any kind of associated hosts that we were finding in the areas. But so far, I think we've only been finding it associated with grape plants. So.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. This is good. I appreciate it.
Let's try Japanese beetle on and see how many questions we have.
Sure. Well, keep going. Feels like a dissertation defense. Okay. So Japanese beetle, I think most of us in the room are probably familiar with this one. It's probably our most notorious pest survey program that we've been operating at ODA since 2016. We think of it as an ornamental pest, but I did want to highlight it is a significant pest of turf grass. And it does, much like by mealybug, it also has a very wide host range. So also, in fact, it can attack over 100 species of plants. I put in that photo of grapes because it will attack grapes. And that's just another thing to be concerned about. Nationally, I think there's well over 30 states that are considered to be heavily infested with Japanese beetle on the West Coast. Obviously, we have Oregon. There's also populations in California, Washington, Idaho, and in Colorado. But I think Oregon's program has definitely been the most aggressive, which is something to be proud of. Because when we look at states like Iowa, for example, you know, they can set out traps and easily collect a garbage bag of beetles pretty quickly there. So the population numbers can definitely get out of hand. And this is also a quarantine pest already in Oregon, which has been helpful in our approach to how we've been able to handle this pest. So the bulk of our infestation is and always has been in the Portland metro area. So initially that was in the Cedar Mill neighborhood. And we've really focused in and around that area, also within the Portland airport area. So on the far right, I did list some numbers to kind of give you at a glance where those populations have been over the course of time. So, you know, starting out in 2017, my eyes are a little bad, so I apologize. 2017, you know, we're at whatever that number says, excuse me, 20-something thousand.
23,000.
Thank you. I did have my eyes checked recently. All the way down to where we're at now, which is, I think, down to 2022. I should have wrote these down. 2024. Well, I'm trying to make the point that we were on a significant downturn. Then in 2023, we saw those numbers pop up. So then the question is, what's going on there? So what we realized is that it was a singular blueberry farm within the Cedar Mill neighborhood. And when I say blueberry farm, not that kind of blueberry farm. It's a small backyard U-pick operation. So they were working on a local level. They were organic, they never sprayed, and because they were in the hub of this infested area, that property also became infested. And because they were never treating, they previously never allowed us to do any treatments near or on their property, they ended up having this little explosion population, which I think is an indicator of this is a little case example of what happens. Thank you, Carla. Of what happens when you're not treating and you have these population densities in the area. So we've seen that in 2 years in a row. We have had success with that particular grower, again, taking time to have those conversations, get them on board, and also finding a chemistry that works for their particular land so they can continue to have their U-pick operation, but also try to really tackle on knocking back those numbers. So the majority of those numbers that you're seeing in 23 and 24, roughly about 76% of those are coming from the blueberry population. So if you can imagine taking away those numbers, statewide our numbers are getting really low, which is good. So it's just that one hotspot that we're really talking about. So next slide, please. This is just a close-up of the image I already showed you in that area, and just kind of give you a little bit of a better idea of what our approach is that being able to take these really large swath population densities, do effective treatment parameters around those and other trapping, and breaking it up into smaller and smaller chunks. So that's effectively what we've been able to do over time. Our treatment program is a twofold punch. We have granular treatments that we're hitting earlier in the season when the beetles are still in their grub stage, when they're in the ground. Then after emergence, which happens a little bit later in the season, if we're seeing live beetles, we can come back and do a spray regime. And that has been proven to be very effective. I will note that since this is a quarantine pest, we do work a lot with landowners to get permissions, to get access for the treatment. And historically, we had funding to provide green waste collection. So that was kind of a really keystone part of our program, which was different than what a lot of other states were doing, to provide areas for the public to bring their green waste, bring any kind of sod that they had. We would collect it and then dispose of it appropriately, free of charge. Unfortunately, we have not been able to provide that service for the past couple years. Next slide, please. In the spirit of transparency, we put together this slide, which kind of just shows trends, right? So the green bars represent, those are our beetle density over time. And again, as I mentioned, we had those little blueberry farms, so that's caused the spike of those green bars over the last 2 years. The gray bars represent your treatment area. So again, we can see over time, we were increasing our treatments, but now as we see beetle populations go down, we were able to tackle back on those treatment areas. The yellow line represents our level of state funding that we have received for this program over time. Currently about flatlined, and I think as been mentioned before, currently our continued funding into the next biennium is unknown. Yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say about that. And so for our outlook in 2025, we currently have funding through the Oregon Invasive Species Council and the Oregon Association of Nurseries that will get us through our program through the end of the biennium, where we'll be focusing on a granular treatment only program at about just under 1,000 acres. So we won't have enough funding to do foliar treatments, but we're going to double down and focus on granular as much as we can in those highest impact sites within the infested area. And we are doing our statewide survey program. I was remiss to mention that yes, we are focusing within the Portland metro area, but we also survey around the entire state, given that we do have frontline infestation potential introductions on all of our sides. So we're doing that, but at a reduced rate. Before I move on, are there any questions about Japanese beetle?
Any questions on Japanese beetle? One, I'm sorry.
No,
Ellen
don't
Miller,
apologize.
for the record. Because there is legislation moving forward on Japanese beetle, but I note the transparency and appreciate it on it kind of let's call it a case at the tail end of the previous slide of, things have gone down except for that. But then, do we have any data if the program completely stops? Any anticipation of what happens, because you guys have been on it for a while, and I'm just trying to relate the legislation to understanding. I can understand why it may not have made it into your budget for this next biennium. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. But again, doing away with the program, do we have history on that, of understanding what that means?
I won't say that we have history to lean on necessarily, but again, I think I'll lean on that blueberry farm as a good example. So that's a small little example of what it looks like once you back off on treatment. So if we don't have treatments, we're not going out and detecting to find those hot spots. We have two risks. One is that the infestations that we already know there, those populations will explode unless people are taking it upon themselves to do treatment. So it's possible maybe the city of Portland will take it upon themselves to implement some spray programs. They're also dealing with the incursion of emerald ash borer, which is also taking up a lot of their bandwidth right now, as many other counties. So who's to say, well, how that will fall out? We also risk in not having that statewide detection. So there's also that possibility that there could be another population introduced somewhere else in the state, and we won't be able to respond. Well, we won't know about it, and we won't be able to respond to it.
Thank you.
Welcome. Our smallest program next is our native plant conservation program. This is a mighty program of 4, plus Troy Abercrombie, who you met yesterday, who's our program manager. Really, the focus of this program, it's a little unique from compared to our other programs. We are working on protecting the things that we have already in the state. So a key task that they are given is maintaining the list of our state threatened and endangered plant species list. And the reason why that's critical for us to be doing is that it really highlights those particular species that deserve particular attention, and also gives us some authority in order to protect those populations. They also do a lot of conservation and management planning, and these are projects and outcomes that then other entities, other agencies can then adopt, because there's very few other organizations that are really doing this specific type of work. So the state list review, it does take a lot of time. By statute, we are required to go through that entire list, and we are supposed to do it every single year. There's about 76 different species on this list. With this small staff that we do have, that's not possible to do on an annual basis. And for decades, we weren't even able to do this work because we didn't have the capacity. So having a double in capacity in the past couple years due to an infusion of state funds has given us the ability to do this. So we do a rotation of evaluating a certain percentage of the list every year, doing the work to make sure that we have the data that supports this is the status of this particular species in this year, and we put together these profiles. And then we give those to our advisory board that then reviews those and accepts the recommendation of the listing. So all in all, the reason we want to do this is make sure the species that are on the list are being tracked, they're being documented and listed appropriately, or maybe they're being recommended for delisting, which is ultimately what we would like to see, which would mean those populations are doing well. The other thing that we do is kind of more on the research side, so I just wanted to highlight this particular example. So this cute little flower, the soft blazing star, which is endemic to Malheur County, and by endemic meaning it's only found in this one particular area in the state. Really, the goal of what we're trying to do is protect these plant populations to keep them off of our list or keep them off of a federal state list as well. And if you are a gardener, or you ever work with native plants, you might know that a lot of these species are very difficult to get to germinate. And a lot of these species, because they're so rare, there's no protocol out there for us to know how to germinate these plants, how to propagate them, and get them up to scale for restoration efforts. So our staff worked a long time in figuring out how to deal with this particular species, again, because it was growing in very rare soil conditions, so that made it a little tricky. Ultimately, they were successful in developing that protocol. We're currently already growing this in mass in our greenhouses down in Corvallis at Oregon State University, and hopefully to get that up to scale. So for other partners who are listed below, such as BLM, ODOT, Nature Conservancy, and others can start working on restoration efforts. So I think that's a small example of some of the other types of work that this program does. And one of the biggest highlights we have also is the native seed strategy, which as you learned about yesterday, which staff worked really, really hard to put that together. And I think that's another shining star of what we've been able to do. Any questions on the native plant program?
When did we establish the advisory committee for the native plant program?
I believe that happened in 2022.
Okay.
I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? No? Okay. So moving on to the nursery and Christmas tree program, very similar to a lot of the functions that we do in hemp. So we're licensing, we're inspecting, we're certifying, similar to a lot of the other programs we do at ODA for the $1 billion nursery industry that we have in Oregon. One key thing I think it's always important to highlight is through those inspections, the staff are serving as a first line of defense for the introduction of unwanted plant pests into the state. So having that staff that's dedicated to that work is pretty critical for us, I think. Next slide, please. I also thought, given our current time, there's a lot of different type of data that I could have pulled out to show, and I apologize, these numbers are very small. But the two things I wanted to point out is, we're expecting a lot of stuff that's coming into the state, and we're also inspecting a lot of material that's going out of the state. So between our Christmas trees and our nursery industry, through these charts is kind of just a breakdown of where these commodities are going worldwide, and this is just the top destinations. You'll probably see a common theme between the Christmas tree and nursery tree that Mexico and Canada make up two of the number one and number two customers for each of those commodity sectors. So I don't think I have to explain why that's of concern, but it definitely is something that I think the industry and us as an agency are watching to see how this shakes out in the long term. So one of the key or biggest things that's really happened, overall, the program's doing great. It's business as usual for the most part, but this particular pest incidence that we had come up last year was probably the most significant invasive species issue that I've had to deal with in the nursery program since I've been with it since 2019. So Phytophthora ostracedrae is a new Phytophthora species. If you're familiar with Phytophthora morum, the causal agent of sudden oak death, this is a related species. This was a first in U.S. detection. So this immediately put this on the radar of USDA APHIS Plant Protection Quarantine, who put this particular pathogen under quarantine, and any properties that we found with this particular species was also put under quarantine. So just a quick rundown, this is a known known pathogen to infect various members of the Cupressaceae family. So these are, roughly speaking, cedars, junipers, eastern red cedar, and western red cedar, Port Orford cedar, which is a native. So that's kind of what we're talking about in the risk. Unfortunately, where we were finding this is all on the West Coast, where we don't have a large distribution of a lot of these species outside of ornamental plantings. So arborvitae, which is western red cedar, is a very high value nursery commodity. So I think, at least in terms of the nursery industry, that's where the heartburn was coming from. And we don't really know much about it because this was, again, first to the US, previously only known to be in the UK or in Argentina. So a lot of unknowns about what landscape impacts this could potentially have. Next slide, please. So how to detect this, because there was so much that we didn't know, made this project extremely challenging. We were mostly looking for kind of dead yellow branches, which, again, with all the heat stress that we've been having, doesn't really say a lot because a lot of these sorts of plants look that way on the landscape level, which didn't really help. And also that's what we were seeing when we were looking at the nurseries. So unfortunately, the only real thing we could look for a true indicator was doing some destructive sampling on all of these plants, looking for these lesions. So on the photo on the left, once we've peeled back the bark, you see that kind of small little oblong yellow orange. that's what we were basically looking for as a key indicator for if this pathogen was present or not. So having to go through that process on thousands and thousands and thousands of plants was a very laborious process. Next slide, please. So the first facility that we found with this was a nursery in Washington County of about 220 acres. The red outlines just shows all the places that ODA staff and also PPQ staff were going to survey for this particular disease. Next slide, please. We were there for several months doing surveys almost on a daily basis. And then in July 2024, a second nursery was confirmed in Clackamas County, this one about 3 times the size. So again, this was an additional pretty big workload to the point where PPQ was flying in staff from other states to help us do the survey because we also have a nursery program to run and an industry to support in addition to all this other work that we were doing. So in a nutshell, kind of what we were seeing after all was said and done, and I think all of this work started in April and was carrying us through all the way into November. So this was definitely a big workload. Nursery A was definitely the one that had the highest level of incidence for disease at about 41% of the plants that we sampled were positive, whereas Nursery B, it was a much smaller level of infestation. Nursery A had definitely experienced significant economic impacts for the amount of material that had to be destroyed. So it was millions of dollars of material that they are still working through to try to destroy. So APHIS is actually moving towards the direction of deregulating this pathogen, and the Department of Agriculture does not have intent to implement a state-level quarantine. For various reasons, one thing I didn't mention was that through our investigative work to find out how this pathogen got here, it does sound like this has likely been in the state for probably 20 years. So this is probably one of these things that's been around for a very long time. And knowing that something has been around that long, we don't have good detection tools. It's not a practical thing to try to quarantine. So instead, we're moving in towards the direction of trying to work with partners at OSU, USDA, ARS, to continue doing surveys, working with the industry to really reinforce the importance of Phytophthora best management practices and education, because we felt that that had kind of subsided a little bit over time. So just more knowledge of knowing kind of where we're finding this and what to look for and how to mitigate it is the approach that we're going for. Any questions on that?
No questions? Great, thank you.
All right. The Noxious Weed Control Program, as the name implies, is responsible for controlling noxious weeds within the state of Oregon. We also oversee the Oregon State Weed Board, which serves as an advisory committee for any recommendations that we make about our noxious weed state lists, and also for the noxious weed grant program that we administer. Biocontrol also makes up an important part of this program, but I won't get into that, but moving on. So main thing I wanted to highlight was the Oregon State Weed Grants, which is a big part of what staff are doing, is again, kind of similar to the native plant program. They're working on making up profiles for all the various weeds, making recommendations for the status of basically how weedy are they within the state and the progress of the work that we're doing and seeing the successes and where the challenges are. So presenting those to the board, we also open up our grant program on an annual basis through cooperation with OWEB, which provides the lottery funds. And so we are implementing those lottery fund dollars to get them on the ground to make sure that we're doing our best to control noxious weeds in the state of Oregon. So 2023, we had a particularly high demand where we had 65 applications, but we were only able to fund about 51 of those. So I think that just kind of continues to show there's always more demand that we are able to fulfill. But we try to do our due diligence and making sure the dollars that we are issuing out are going to have the most impact on the landscape. One glimpse of this, of where those grant dollars are going. So this is kind of a graphic that we haven't really looked at before And I think on the lower right, it does tell you the source of where we were getting this from, which I apologize, I can't read it once again. But really, as I wanted to highlight, and this is really bad image now that I see this here, so I apologize. It's supposed to show you the distribution of where these grants are going, and it's really hard to see on this, I'm sorry. But basically just trying to highlight, we are getting a distribution of those grant dollars to undeserved communities, which if you have it on in paper, you can see the star that has the darkest outline. Seeing those that we're getting those dollars out into Eastern Oregon, we're getting them out to Southwestern Oregon and to areas that typically don't see a lot of the funds that we are distributing. So I just thought that that was important to highlight. Any questions on the WeBoard grants before I jump over?
Elin Miller for the record. Just so, who applies? Individuals, counties?
Counties.
Counties only. So it's their county we control. Okay.
For the most part. But there are some others, but it's mostly county.
Can soil and water conservation districts or watershed councils apply for these funds?
I think they can, yes. Chair Lopez?
Miguel Lopez for the record. So the folks that go without funding based on your weed grant componentry here, 65 and 54 versus 5142 that got funded, are we able to redirect those folks to a different source?
Unfortunately, this is one of the key sources of this type of funding in the state, which is part of the reason why this is such a competitive grant process. So we do offer grant training. So typically for those folks that aren't successful, our grant coordinator does take a lot of strive to give feedback of why these grants were successful and try to do some kind of coaching and mentoring to encourage them, this is how you can be more successful in the future. And sometimes the reason that they're not funded isn't because the grant isn't of muster. It's maybe the particular species that they're trying to get funding for that the board decides that, there's other higher priority species that need that attention versus the ones that that particular grantee had submitted action for.
One more question, Elin Miller for the record. Private land. So from a private land application, is there an educational program? I've just in my short time in Oregon just seen hillsides become yellow that were never yellow before, and probably on private land, but do some of the landowners understand that that's not necessarily pretty? I'm just wondering who is educating private landowners on noxious weeds?
That's a really good question. So in part, it can happen from, we rely on partnerships with Extension Service or county, soil water conservation districts, but also that in part is what our regional specialists are also doing as well. So they also help provide that outreach and education. So we get a lot of calls from the public asking what to do about tansy, what to do about gorse. And so we do provide that information as well, or we're passing down that information to other partners who can then help disseminate that information, provide site visits to kind of give guidance. So that's most of it.
I'll just follow on because obviously if private land is totally infested, the public land gets the benefit of that infestation.
Yes.
So it's a circular issue.
It is. And then there can be neighbor disputes and that sort of thing, which also gets complicated. And then, pesticides or herbicides are one of the primary tools that we're also using. So that can also add a little bit of layer of complication to those conversations as well. The Oregon Invasive Species Council is not a program within our division, but it is a quasi-government agency. So they live within the budget of the ODA, but they sort of operate kind of like a nonprofit. So it's the members constitute various state agencies and also some other smaller nonprofit organizations that make up collectively on the council. So House Bill 41418 was passed last year, and with that, it gave an infusion to the council to actually be able to release a outreach and education grant, which was the first time in the council's history that they were able to do that. Although this is something in statute as a function of the council, they have unfortunately never had the actual funds to be able to implement and release a grant program. So this was kind of a big accomplishment. really important to the council's mission. So I just wanted to share that they were able to issue about $170,000 of funds over 10 different projects last year. And if you take a second, you can see kind of the types of projects that were successful in funding. And much like the Oregon State Weed Board grants, many more applicants that we were able to fund. So the demand was definitely there, and there was a lot of excitement about this particular grant opportunity. On the next slide, I just want to show kind of the distribution of where those grant dollars went. So again, a lot into Southwest Oregon, Eastern Oregon, Central Oregon. And the key types of projects that were being funded were those focused on aquatic invasive species and also those on terrestrial noxious weed species were kind of the lion's share of that work. And I guess the last thing I wanted to touch on, we've talked a lot about this week already, is federal funds within all of the different entities and arms that we work in. And so I pulled together this, and I realize some of the numbers here are missing, so I apologize for that. But just to show, at least for the plant division over the next biennium, there was about a $6 million estimate of federal funds that we would be on the table to receive. Now that could change again, we don't really know. But the lion's share, about over 50% of those funds are coming from USDA APHIS PPQ, which is one of the things I know that gives Director Lisa Sharplow-Hanson a little bit of anxiety, gives myself a little bit of anxiety with the unknowns of how that's going to work out. But without these funds, we really can't implement a lot of the key functions of what our programs do.
Well, I was just going to say thank you. This was very helpful to come up to speed with an area that maybe doesn't get the attention it really actually needs. And so I just wanted to say thank you for that. And also with that kind of jeopardy potential and uncertainty with $6 million worth of funds is something we're going to really need to be watching very carefully.
Thank you.
Director Norris?
Ellie Norris for the record. Going back to the Japanese beetle, with the issue of the funding coming and just how prolific this is there any coordination with you guys working with independent trappers like Wilbur Ellis and the agronomists there, and then the sharing of that data?
I'll be honest, at this point, we have not done a lot of that, but we have done that for other smaller efforts. So I will give an example of light brown apple moth, which was deregulated back in 2021. We did have a small grant that we were working with Peerbolt to do some targeted surveys on very particular grow sites that were really concerned about trade impacts if they had LBAM on their properties. So that was a successful partnership. To do something like that on the scale of Japanese beetle, I think would be challenging unless, again, we had very specific growers or sites that were looking for that kind of monitoring and trapping.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes. Thank you. For the record, Lisa Sharplow-Hanson. So I think the plant protection area, you've gotten a good sense of the breadth of the work that's there. And there's a lot. Historically, over time, we have become more and more reliant on federal funds for many of the functions that we do there, and have seen declines in terms of, the state funding coming to the program on the general fund side for sure. And lottery funds are always incredibly highly competitive through Measure 76. And so I think, strategizing around what we could be doing or thinking about into the future, we could use some help thinking maybe creatively around that in terms of, what do we do to build awareness in this area? And then the other piece, and thank you, Chris, for acknowledging my anxiousness. Sorry. It's okay. It's all good. With those federal dollars, they are not keeping up with inflation. And the cost of doing business everywhere has gone up, in the last 3 years, 5 years. Those funds are asking more of us with less money even without inflation in it. And that's becoming more of a challenge in terms of, so then when do we start making choices? In terms of what do we do? What don't we do? How do we pick the priorities with so many high priority pests, but we don't have a backfill to do the amount of work that's being requested? So I leave that there. I think there's room for further conversation. We're deep into, the budget for 25-27 with the governor's budget out there, but looking ahead to 27-29, some ideas and some help from the board and thinking about maybe some ways that we could reposition, remarket around the program and focusing it. Could be really helpful conversation with the board.
Great. Let's plan on that for sure. And as you said, we're kind of in flight, but I'm also thinking this might be an interesting subject for the quarterly report too, which we'll discuss a little later. So good. Yes.
Eric Orm, do the nursery groups and the vineyard groups and the commissions, do they tax themselves for research like this to help? So and the reason I ask is, like, my experience would be on the wheat industry. We assess ourselves a tax through our commission, and a lot of that money is used for research, for disease and variety through OSU and extension. And I was just curious if other commissions do the same to help backfill some of the funding issues in the future.
Well, why don't you begin? Director Lopez had punted to me for wine, but I can't speak to it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, I'll tackle part of that then. So thank you for the question. So for the nursery industry and Christmas tree industry, it differs. So the Christmas industry does not have a commission. They do have an advisory board, but beyond the license fees that we receive, there's no other source of funding to support industry or research or other initiatives. The nursery program, the nursery industry did implement that through the license fees, a certain percentage of those funds go into an emergency account that then can be used for certain initiatives to support any kind of emergency response, so that they put those funds towards the Japanese beetle on 2 different occasions, for example. They also have a certain percentage of license fees that go into a research-specific grant that then the ODA works with the OAN to distribute those dollars to research programs that then are targeted at the industry. The Oregon Wine Board also has a research grant that ODA has tapped into before for the vine mealybug response, I think on 2 different occasions. Beyond that, it's few and far between, and it kind of depends on the commodity group in question.
Yeah, and I'll just, Elin Miller for the record, add on for wine. We're actually not a commodity board. Oregon Wine Board is independent of that. And the research dollars, yes, we are taxed heavily on our production of grapes with the grape tax, and those monies go into the board, but it's also spent on research and enology, wine production, and lots of other stuff, which makes a lot of sense. But you look at that breadth. So it took a lot to get OWB, Oregon Wine Board, to focus on the mealybug and utilize some monies, because it's a very small portion of their budget that's used for this sort of thing, and it's kind of research, but it's not. So that was part of our issue as well. So things to be fixed, that we're working on other ways to fix that too. So.
Thank you.
Ty Cleaver for the record. This is a comment. You know a lot about a lot, and that was a lot to take in, but it was very informative.
Thank you. I thought you were going to ask a brewery question, but no, sorry. Great. Well, thank you, Chris. This is a long time coming to have you up here and spend some time, quality time with you, and really appreciate everything you and your division is doing, and just appreciate the leadership. So Unless there's any other questions, we are at,
Thank you.
yeah, actually, basically now, let me just make sure my time is right. We are at a very quick break. And so if you don't mind the 5-minute break, and we'll reconvene at 10 because that is time for public comment. And we want to be on time in case somebody zooms in for that. So thank you.
Basta con mirar tus ojos y sentir tu compañía para que a mí se me olviden los misterios de la vida. Basta con ganarme un beso del baúl de tus deseos para que la noche traiga lo más grande en un te quiero, porque en ti encuentro todo lo que soñé, en nada me equivoqué. Sara, tú no me agradezcas nada, que todo te lo debo, Sara. Tu sonrisa y tu mirada son mi alegría y mi consuelo, Sara. ¿Qué sería de mi vida de haberme yo perdido el placer de estar contigo en este amor que nos unió? No imagino de otra forma ni un minuto de mis días sin saber que yo te tengo, que me das tu simpatía. No me importa que termine el valor de economía. No conozco más riqueza que saber que tú eres mía, porque en ti encuentro todo lo que soñé, en nada me equivoqué. Sara, tú no me agradezcas nada, que todo te lo debo, Sara. Tu sonrisa y tu mirada son mi alegría y mi consuelo, Sara. ¿Qué sería de mi vida de haberme yo perdido el placer de estar contigo en este amor? Amor que de verdad se deja ir sin escondernos nada. Felicidad tiene tu olor, tu cara enamorada. Mejor tal vez no pudo ser. Sara, tú no me agradezcas nada, que todo te lo debo, Sara. Tu sonrisa y tu mirada son mi alegría y mi consuelo, Sara. ¿Qué sería de mi vida de haberme yo perdido el placer de estar contigo en este amor? Amor que nos unió.
Quiet chords from my guitar, floating on the silence that surrounds us. Quiet thoughts and quiet dreams, quiet walks by quiet streams, and a window that looks out on Corcovado. Oh, how lovely.
Como perlas preciosas, amor.
I think you really should forget who said this. Everybody's looking for Liz. Yeah. Prices have just skyrocketed.
Great, we'll reconvene the meeting, and we are now open to public comment, but we have no public comment sign up here, but I'll just ask again if anyone online, I don't think so, but anyone online was wanting to make public comments. We want to have you put your name in the chat box and stuff if you did, but if you had not done so already, we're going to assume there is none. And I want to thank Crystal Grinnell. Yes, Grinnell. Crystal for being available to come up and begin her presentation a little early so we can maybe get ahead of schedule in what we do after this, because we want to keep on time with our other presenters, like our next presenter with DLCD at 11. We'll keep that, but we may have some board business we'll jump into that we can do in the interim so we can kind of keep on schedule. So thank you very much. Appreciate you joining us. And I don't know if Lisa, you want to make any introductory comments on this portion of the presentation?
Sure, happy to. So excited to have Crystal come and visit with us. We've been working several natural resource agencies on the update to the integrated resource strategy for a while now. It's taken a couple of turns along the way, and I think Crystal's going to give us the latest round of trying to capture what was taken in through a public comment period that happened in the fall, and doing some refocusing around that. So I'm looking forward to getting caught up and talking about next steps.
Great. Thank you, Director. Thank you, Chair Miller and members of the board. For the record, my name is Crystal Grinnell. I am the Integrated Water Resources Strategy over at the Water Resources Department, and I'm here to give you an update on where we're at with that whole update process and that strategy. And I will provide a little background for folks too if you're not familiar with the strategy. So let's go ahead and jump into the presentation here. So a few things I want to cover. I'll give a little bit of background, not too much in depth there. And then we'll give an overview on the strategy update process. We have been working on this update since 2022. So it's been a long process here. And then I will hit at a very high level some changes for the 2025 strategy. We are now calling it the 2025 strategy since we are expecting adoption at some point this year. And then I'll just wrap up a little bit with some discussion about implementation. Thank you. So we can talk about what's next and how we're going to translate this strategy into action. Next slide, please. All right, so the background that I wanted to give folks. This, the Integrated Water Resources Strategy is codified in statute here. So we've got Oregon Revised Statute is the place where you would go if you want to see what is supposed to be in the strategy and helpfully all the entities that are required to be involved in developing that strategy. And there are quite a few agencies that are specifically named and called out. I also want to highlight that we do have two prior versions of the strategy. So the first one was developed in 2012. There was a 5-year requirement to update that strategy. So that was done in 2017. Back in 2023, we got a pretty significant update to the statute. And one of the updates in that statute required that we are shifting over from a 5-year update frequency to an 8-year update frequency. So that's, I think, a good change for us just in terms of the size and complexity of this strategy. I think it'll be helpful to move to that update strategy. So that's one big change. And then another piece I'll just highlight here because it will become relevant later on. Another change that happened to the statute is that we're now required to do biennial work plans. So that was never something that was required before. So I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end, but that's a really significant change as well. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate here, we do have two prior versions of the strategy. I've just put the covers of the two documents here. So the 2012 version, really the bulk of what we see even today was developed back in that very first version. The second version that came out in 2017, it was essentially the same information. It did get the addition of 9 more actions added to it. So not a significant overhaul, but definitely just an update that happened between those two. Next slide, please. So this slide that I'm sharing is the 2017 thing we call the framework, which essentially shows all of the contents of the document. And so I've handed out the draft to 2025 strategy for folks to see close up. We've essentially taken this 2017 framework and we're proposing some updates to it. A few changes to some names for the actions, and we've renumbered a few things just to reflect some input that we've received along the way. Next slide, please. And so this little zoom in here is, I think, most helpful for folks online so they can see what we're talking about. That last framework there had about 51 actions listed on it. And so I just wanted to provide a zoom in on the language that folks could see here, what we're talking about when we say there's 51 actions. What does an action look like? So in those framework documents, the actions are written in a format where they give you the general sense of what the action needs to do, but in terms of the details, in terms of how you might carry out that action, you need to go to the document and read a little bit more. And we've also created some more resources to move that forward as well. So just that challenge that we all have when we're writing strategies, keeping things high level, identifying actions, but then getting it down to the nuts and bolts of acting on it. Sometimes you need more information. So next slide, please. All right, just to reiterate the process we've gone through on this update. So I came on board in 2022. We started mid-2022. We started doing some planning for the document. And then in 2023, we hit the ground running with some engagement. So we did our public outreach and engagement in 2023. That took a lot of different forms. It did include about 7 in-person meetings around the state. So we tried to hit all the diverse places of Oregon, all the corners that we could. We also did an online survey as well to get a lot of input from folks. So really just letting everyone know that that was the year that we were focusing on our engagement. And that informed our first draft. And that came out in 2024. So that was in March that we released draft 1. We're now looking at releasing draft 2 almost a year later here. So in April, that's what we're targeting. And so between the draft 1 and draft 2, there has been a lot of work really on a new piece of the document. And I'll get into that in just a moment. It's really the priorities component of the IWRS that was never a part of it before. So next slide, please. Just to also carry through this idea of the draft 2 coming out, what we are planning on doing is moving towards adoption in September. So this document is interesting because it does require input from over 15 state agencies, around 10 federal agencies. A lot of folks have their input on this document. But at the end of the day, it's the Water Resources Commission that adopts the document. And so that's who I've been working with over the last almost 3 years now, just as we've been working through updates and refining the document in general. So we will, the plan for the next steps here on the adoption is that we'll have our second draft out, get some public comment, revise that document, get input from the Water Resources Commission in our June meeting, and then hopefully finalize that document this summer and then go before the commission in September for full adoption. Next slide, please. So now I'll just walk through some of the new features that folks might expect. If you're familiar with the 2017 document, there are some very new things happening in draft 2 of our 2025 strategy. So I'll hit on the action priorities. That's something that's very new. And then the revisions to the framework. The framework, again, is that 11 by 17 that all of the board members now have in front of them with the 4 colorful boxes there. And then I'll just touch very quickly on some changes to the narrative that we're planning. Next slide, please. So first, the state action priorities. So there was an exercise that was taken on last year with Director Hansen was involved, but also 5 other directors that we had. So even though there's 15 state agencies, we weren't able to get all 15 in a room together, but we did pull together 6 directors and the governor's office to sit down and think through how we might take all of the around 50 actions that we have in this strategy. How can we narrow down what we really need to do and accomplish over the next 8 years before the next update is due? So that exercise was done last year with several workshops with directors, in addition to having some public engagement and outreach and some input on those draft priorities. And so where things have landed now is essentially 3 big priority areas. And so the 3 that are guiding all of these actions that fall underneath it are act with urgency. So the actions that we need to do right away to help resolve some quantity, quality, and ecosystem issues that we have at this very moment. Then looking forward, the next priority area is assisting our communities in being prepared for all the changes that we have in front of us. And then finally, adapting to less water. So climate change has been really, there's a lot of different projections that are associated with climate change, but a really big one is water scarcity, hotter and drier summers, and we're going to need to do more with less, essentially. So a lot of action items related to that category are associated with certain project types and also increasing incentives to help really increase the pace and scale of the types of projects we need to accomplish to do more with less. Next slide, please. So the state action priority exercise, just to reiterate that it was 6 agencies that were leading that effort. There are still actions that pull in additional agencies as well. Also, just to note that it's really a 5 to 7 year window. So that's really three of the next biennia where we're able to really focus our asks from the legislature. You know, if we need policy changes or if we need funding to accomplish that, that's really the next 3 biennia is the focus for these priorities. And then the other piece that I really want to emphasize that's very new and different is that, so state action priorities were never part of the document before. That's something that's new. In addition to that, we're getting pretty specific about the outcomes that we're looking at. So this is also a new effort. This was driven by the governor's request here that we really ramp up the transparency and the accountability on the strategy. And so all of these action priorities are going to have some outcomes associated with them. So that's something important to look for. And then the last thing I'll mention on this priorities piece is that, you know, with the statute update, we are required to do a biennial work plan. So that's really going to be where we're going to focus our energy, is these priorities are going to translate directly into that work plan and help guide us over a 2-year window. So that's going to be a work plan that tries to pull together multiple agencies with a water nexus, all moving in the same direction. Next slide, please. So the 3 pieces of the document I was going to talk about were the state action priorities. We just talked about that. The next is the framework here. So the framework is the 11 by 17 document that you have in front of you. This is a really important shortcut for understanding a very long document. So the document itself is over 200 pages, but having a framework where you can see all of the actions in one place is very helpful to see where your interests can be found within the document or within the action list. We have proposed some changes. So the version that you all have in front of you, there are some red text numbers there where we've proposed some slight renumbering to just make things reflect our current situation a little bit better. We do also have 2 new actions that we're adding to the document. So we found, just a little bit of context, we did find that when we were doing engagement and outreach for this process, a lot of the needs that folks had were covered in various ways across those other 51 actions. It was really the implementation piece that we all are saying that we need to crank up. So that's why we're spending so much effort now on implementation and accountability for our priorities. But really, this strategy is so broad, it really addresses so many issues that we have. So that's why we don't have a ton of new action items. There were really just 2 very small ones that were missing, we felt. So the last thing I'll mention is that really another change that we have is the color system that you'll see on there. There is a purpose for that. So in the document itself, the 200-page document, we do have each chapter color-coded, and then we also have action summary sheets that just give a lot of detail about how to implement a single action. They're all color-coded as well. So it's just helpful, I think, from a accessibility and a conceptual perspective. When you've got over 50 action items, it gets a little overwhelming. So we've broken it down into a few different categories there. And so they're broken down by chapter, which is also objective. So when you are looking at your framework piece of paper there, the dark bolded headings are all the objectives that we're trying to get. So every action is associated with an objective there. Next slide, please. So just for folks that are watching online, here's the full draft that we are putting out in April. Next slide, please. And finally, the draft 2 narrative edits that I'll just touch on real quick. So I am showing a little snapshot there on our slideshow of the action 1-page summaries that I just mentioned. So that's what those look like. They're They're giving a lot more information than you would have found in the 2017 version. We've added information about what agencies would be involved in those actions, which was a huge, I think a huge improvement, just in terms of really getting the purpose of this document is to get us all integrated in terms of working together on water. And sometimes it's hard to know who has a lead role or a supporting role. So that's really where we started with this, is identifying our lead agencies and identifying those partnerships, and then also acknowledging the supporting roles, because there's some really important supporting roles that we have across all of our agencies. And then another difficult endeavor in making these one-page summaries was adding another column for partners. So identifying all of the other partners out there that would be really helpful collaborative elements to this action. So tribes are of course an important piece of that, but we've also got a lot of local governments, our soil and water conservation districts, our watershed councils. Those types of entities are also very important. And just by saying, OWEB or ODA as our agency, representation or supporting really didn't capture that enough, right? So we did add in more specificity there with our partners. So you will also find just a quick blurb on those sheets about the purpose of that action. So a quick background for you on why we need that action without having to read the full 200-page narrative document. And then we've got example actions on there that really help make it tangible. And those were all developed in close coordination with all of our agency partners on those. And then we've also provided resources for folks. In some cases, we're able to identify a funding source, which is really helpful, I think, for folks if they're thinking about, hey, this action seems very applicable to me. How do I fund this? That's something that we did try to add if we knew of a funding source. So there's a lot of hyperlinks there and funding sources if we know what they are. And then also some deliverables. Some of these actions have been in the strategy since 2012 and folks have been working on them. So we do have some progress and some deliverables, and sometimes those are also provided at the bottom as well. So some other changes that are happening in addition to adding that new element there. So we've got this, these action one-page summaries, we're putting them fully in their own appendix. So you can really just, peel that away if that's what you need for your purposes. But we also are adding a few other pieces as well. So the front section of the document will include the priorities. So right now, you will, for draft 2 that's coming out in April, you will initially see the focus on just the handful of actions that we've decided to elevate as a priority. And then you can read the full document that includes all of the remaining actions. But that priority section will be new and at the front of the document. Next slide, please. So the last thing I want to touch on is implementation. So just reiterating that we're in a new process for this because we've never had the requirement for work plans before. That really changes our approach. And we've also never had those priorities, right? So this is a new ongoing creative process here. Once we get this document adopted, we'll move into implementation. But the things that we'll really be focusing on is really getting that coordinated action across multiple agencies. And really that will focus on the priority actions that we've spent the last year identifying. Next slide, please. So another thing about implementation that I want to highlight is that the goal that we're trying to get to is really to align that process with our budgeting cycle. So if we can get all of our sister agencies working together to develop those work plans, but then also having that aligned smartly with our budgeting process, that will really help align our efforts so that we're all planning to make some effort on a certain action, but also have the resources to do that. So that's really the cycle that we're learning or we're working on developing right now, is how we can get in a little bit more of a repetitive biennial cycle with this IWRS, with this strategy, so that we're pulling in those priorities into our budgeting cycle. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, I wanted to give another slide here of these last few steps to get us towards adoption on this document. So April will be our public comment window. In May, I'll be giving those comments that we received from draft 2 to the Water Resources Commission. They'll have some time to digest that, and then we'll have our June meeting, and we'll be able to discuss any final edits that the Water Resources Commission wants to the document. And we can make those, the IWRS interagency team will be making those then over the summertime. And then that would hopefully put us at getting the final version in front of the commission prior to their September meeting so that they could propose adoption at that time. So that's really what we're marching towards at this point, is really getting our second version out, get that refined, hear from folks if we've hit the mark or not, and then get our final edits done this summer so that we can move into adoption and then quickly move into implementation and work plan development. Right, I think that's it. Next slide here. I think that's my last slide. Yes, so my contact information if folks have any questions.
Thank you, Crystal. I'll open it up to any questions or comments from the board. Director Lopez.
Miguel Lopez for the record. Crystal, thank you very much. This is super, super informative. When it all gets done with in September, is there a hard copy that folks could get their hands on that are looking to get more involved into this?
Yes, thank you for that question. Once we do have this document done, we will be printing out paper copies. We've always done that in the past. We will have an electronic version as well available, but that's something that we're targeting to have, that available to folks. We've always done that, and we've noticed that some folks do prefer a paper version as well. So we'll make sure that info is available on the website. We do have a special IWRS page on our website, so we can share that information there.
Ty Cleaver for the record. Will this preempt existing rights?
No.
Elin Miller for the record. So I like the idea of the accountability that you're focusing in as far as looking at lead agencies, support agencies, et cetera. I guess my question is, since that's new, and before you can get into the next biennium for funding and other things, it's a do more with less from all the agencies. It sounds like to me, at least for thought leadership at a minimum. Has there been any funding to help support this more robust effort in the legislation that was asked, that they asked for the work plans? That's one question. And two, tangential to that, there was a huge water package last year that got narrowed down, and I'm assuming this is the narrowed down of that. But was there anything else, and maybe you can't speak to that, but to the extent you could, anything else that was being thought of in that big package? And maybe this effort was not driven by that, but again, I wasn't tracking the water legislation very carefully.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Chair Miller. So to the first question, the resources just for really guiding the strategy, I think an important piece of it, just to simplify it, is really coordination, right? That we've had this strategy and we need a champion to take that strategy and do something with it. And it is landed in Water Resources Department, and it's in their court, right, to have they're shepherding the document, essentially. They didn't have a full-time staff for a window of time on that. And so there was a legislative investment in the strategy in 2021 to give a limited duration position, to reinstate essentially a limited duration position to coordinate the document. So that's the limited duration position that I applied for and was able to get. So that's why I came on board in 2022. And really the impetus for that was at the time the legislature acknowledged that they needed staff capacity to even be able to do an update. An update was due and they didn't have capacity. So that was an investment there. That in 2023 the position was made permanent. So I think that does show that the legislature is serious about using this strategy as a main tool for us to coordinate our water efforts. As far as the water investments that have occurred. So 2021 and 2023 were huge years for water investment from a state perspective. So multiple agencies were able to get increased funding, and a lot of the things that have been showing up in the strategy since the 2012 version, the asks, essentially, the things that we're all saying we need, were finally funded in some capacity. And it really varies if you were to dig into each individual action item that got some funding. It's quite variable in terms of how much it got. Some of the action items got enough to kickstart that effort, and we'll be continuing work on those actions over many, many years. That's kind of the nature of some of the actions. They are very big, and they're kind of big asks, big needs, and we do need sustained funding over multiple biennia to make progress on those actions. So I hope that helps answer the question a little bit. Yes.
So Chair Miller, I would ask Isaac to come talk about the piece that ODA received to help support the IWRS and just give you a sense of where that's at.
Yeah, good morning. Isaac Stapleton, Natural Resources Division Director. Yes, so in the 2023 budget, we received a position for working on the IWRS. It was actually, the legislature took a position that was focused on water quantity and took that position and turned it into an IWRS focused position. So we're currently in the process of recruiting and filling that. Actually, it just was approved this last week to go down and start that recruitment process to get a person on board to continue to engage in the IWRS process once the plan's done, the implementation and the plan development and all those pieces. So
that answers. It's nice to say, and but tough to do if you have or spread so thin. So that, at least I'm sure it could be more different, but it looks like it's adequate. So thank you. Thank you. Yes, Director Orem.
Eric Orem. Thank you, Crystal, for your presentation. So looking forward, one of your slides mentioned adapt to do more with less. And I was just curious, is there plans to increase water storage? I'm thinking like aquifer recharge. It's been working, I think, pretty well in our area. Or storage reservoirs that could be used both for fire and agriculture, trying to catch some of the runoff, or utilizing more of Columbia River water. Since I've been involved in agriculture in the Northwest, I've seen how Washington has used the Columbia River for agriculture, and it seems like when it gets to Oregon, it just shuts off. And those are just some of the questions I have. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the first part about the aquifer recovery piece, that is specifically in the priorities section regarding two things. One is modernizing that process. So there's an important permitting component to that needs some modernization. So that's been flagged as something that folks know needs some improvement to, again, to just increase the pace and scale of that tool that we have. So that's on the table. And then the other piece of that would be also incentives to be able to fund some of these things. So that's a big piece of the adapt to doing more with less, is really just saying outright that we need more incentives for these voluntary projects that can put us in a position to, stretch our water further than, in a water scarce environment. So that's something I would look for there. We didn't get just like reservoir expansion didn't make the list of priorities, but on the full list of action items, so in the full 40, I think we're at 48 or 49 full actions right now. In the full strategy, we do have a storage action item. So just to reiterate that these priorities are really where we're going to focus our asks for money or resources or attention, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to keep working on those other ones as well. So there may be perfect opportunities to do exactly what you're saying, where, we do have a, dam safety component too, where there could be opportunities where we need to upgrade dams for safety reasons. And maybe there's also an opportunity to restore its original storage capacity as well, right? Because sometimes those that's a piece of the puzzle that's happened with, infrastructure, where if maintenance hasn't been occurring, we've lost some storage capacity, and maybe there's an opportunity to restore that. So that particular very specific thing didn't make it in the priority list, but it's still on the table as far as a possibility. If folks wanted to come forward and support that, it still is supported by the IWRS.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? This one, how best do individuals engage in your development? Obviously, representation of the department and all of that, but other individuals, how do they engage in the input? And maybe you kind of covered that, but like at this point in time, you're kind of toward the end. So how best to do so for ideas, like Director Orem noted.
Right. Thank you, Chair Miller. So the most current thing would be to give some comments on draft 2. When we release that in April, that would be the best opportunity to hear from folks. We'll have that 30-day window open, so that's the best place, and then we can make sure that those comments are addressed in that last round. I brushed over it very quickly, but we did have a lot of public engagement back in 2023, where we were trying to get input from many corners of the state. We did hire a facilitation coordinator to help us really hear from voices that we had not heard from before, and to really broaden the involvement and input on the IWRS compared to previous years. So that kind of front end piece is already done, right? We did that to find out, what are your water concerns? What are the water solutions that we're not thinking of? And then we cross-check that to make sure that the strategy reflected what was in there. And then we proposed changes to the strategy based on that input. So that's kind of where we've gotten to now here with, right before draft 2. Draft 2 should reflect, all of that input, plus the input we received on draft 1, right? We will be doing 2 rounds of public comment to really make sure, did we get it right? And give, sometimes you just need that extra opportunity to make sure everything's in there, so.
Yeah, and I think too, just from a public comment standpoint, do you have any read on the amount of input from agricultural producers in that effort?
Thank you, Chair Miller. I don't think I have a good answer for that. I mean, we do have a lot of water partners that were very involved, that represent the agricultural communities that were involved in the development of this strategy. So I think it's just, we will see what we hear on this, draft 2 from those different stakeholders and those water partners.
Yeah, and that's very helpful, because a lot of times until something gets critically urgent, and with especially this all hitting during the legislative session, the attention and bandwidth for people to give on something so important for Oregon, it makes it kind of difficult, but creating awareness for that is going to be important. So thank you. Any other questions, comments? Appreciate you coming and sharing the strategy with us.
Thank you so much for your time.
Great. Super. Okay, so my bat clock says we have 20 minutes before our 11 o'clock portion of our agenda. And so we will, I think, because unless anybody has any issues with that, we still have solar siting rulemaking, and that's obviously, we want to have the public be able to jump on at 11 if anybody wants to listen to that. But we do have our board business. And as we said earlier, the OWEB report will basically kind of had it, but we will postpone that till next time around. I'll hold on resolutions for now, because it may well be that one of our directors that had to head home for some issues occurring there might be able to jump on when we get to the resolutions, but we might be able to spend 20 minutes on talking about newsletter topics. And even though we haven't heard on the solar rulemaking piece, we can always add that in. And because this has, been, it's been a resource challenge on having quarterly reports. We haven't had them for at least 2 years, I think, maybe more. Yeah. I think it's been more than 2 years since we haven't had them. We talk about them, but then just the ability to get them, written and all that in. And so it may well be to be helpful because we're transitioning with Carla, and to make sure there's enough bandwidth and we all may have to want to help a little bit on crafting some things with obviously the oversight of the department and make sure we get it right. But I really think it's important. We brought this up in some of our meetings with legislators yesterday, and at least I was getting kind of an indication of, positivity that we would put things in front of them on a quarterly basis that were timely and important. So I would just, suggest that we think about right now what we heard at this meeting, maybe even digging back before, if there's some ideas that might surface. And then if we can, I'd be happy to write some things if it's helpful, and others maybe we can assign to write some things if it's helpful. So Director Orm.
So I don't have Eric Orm for the record, I don't have a topic per se, but something that was a request by an office yesterday was they really liked the regional facts and maps in the back of our 2025 report, but they were wondering if they could get it by congressional district so that they knew, so that when we went in there and we said, this is affecting this many farms in that district, they really have an idea of how many farms it is, it's by region, but I don't know if there's a tool to do it by district. Just an idea.
So I'm looking to Jonathan. So remember, a lot of this is dependent on the ag stats.
Correct.
And how we pull our data together. And so he may have a better sense for what is and isn't available through that process.
Good morning, Chair Miller, Director Sharple-Hanson, members of the board, Jonathan Sando, Deputy Director. On that, so the current data is broken down by congressional districts, but I think they're asking for like their legislative districts, right? We would not be able to do that because we don't have that individual data points to kind of overlay that piece to it. We can reach out to USDA NASS and see if that's something that we could partner with them on. I think it is interesting data, but that is not something that we would be able to kind of organically create because, again, like all that data lives with NASS, and then how they produce it, how we see it, would not be able to be kind of compiled that way. But interesting request, and I think it's something that we can definitely reach out to NASS around.
Thank you.
Okay. Great. Just for discussion, unless somebody has some things to throw out that we might want to include in the quarterly report, I think, the update we had, Ellie, if you have an idea first, I'd rather have somebody else go versus me.
Okay.
Director Norris.
Ellie Norris for the record. I have a couple of bullet points just to throw them out, but avian flu update would be a good one around the biosecurity. I found Stacy's Dean's update fascinating.
Yes.
And something along the lines of the funding and the misperception of where indirect costs go. I don't know if that's appropriate for the newsletter, but I found it very informative. And then Chris's plant protection and conservation, the pest of concerns was very fascinating.
And to the extent we can talk about the reliance on federal funding to make this happen would be nice as well, I think, for that. Good. I would, actually, those were streaming. We're streaming. But I saw also a lower Umatilla Basin update too, because I think being able to provide the legislature with what's being done, and obviously a lot of people read this report too, in addition, that because it's going to legislators, I think the great ideas that are coming forward on how we may look at efficiencies with nitrates and things like that, I think is important and where we're at in the process. So I don't know if Director Orem, you feel that makes sense because you're really our person on this.
Eric Orem, and Isaac can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for our first quarterly, the newsletter's quarterly, correct?
Right.
And for the first quarter, I don't know that we would be in a position to give an update as far as more than that we are just sitting down for rule writing. But in the second quarter, I would think we would have more to release as an update.
Okay.
Is that fair?
Director Norris?
Sorry, I have one more. Ellie Norris for the record. I think a positive highlight would be the Food Northwest Taste of the States that we'll have booths at. I think that would be a nice positive.
Okay, great. So understand on the lower Umatilla, I guess my point was, I think there's a lot of anxious people out there. And I guess the question is, are people tracking on what you're talking about? Because it might reduce angst even though it's premature. But maybe it's too premature, and if it is, we can do it next quarter. But let's note for the record that we want to do it next quarter. So, okay, all right. Okay, so we've got avian flu, Dean's report, plan. Oh, yes.
That's a question. So Taste of the States. Taste of the States is in May. So should that be a Q1 or a Q2 item? Because we could report out on the results of being there after your next board meeting.
Or awareness to, because you've got a list. Well, but you've got a waiting list, right? Do we want to actually get more people involved at this stage? It's
We're
full.
full. Yeah, is my understanding.
Wait, okay. Report out, okay.
In the newsletter, it might be helpful to have like a dates to keep in mind, like I know, upcoming activities. And so
I love it.
you could have rule writing to let people know that you are currently working on projects.
Good idea.
But then later quarters, you could respond and give a report of what happened as they arrive.
That was brilliant. I love it.
That's why you're vice chairman. Yeah. All right, good deal. Okay, so we'd wait on Taste of the States. We'd wait on La Guama. But we would look at avian flu. We'd look at Dean Simonich's update, Chris's perspective, and I'm missing that last one. Oh, actually, you just did taste. We'd wait. So there's 3 so far. Anything else we can think of that makes some sense here? And this may be coordinating with something when we talk about resolutions that I think is important. We heard a lot this meeting, very concerning comments from the various agriculture and other constituents. And either we say something in a newsletter about the importance or we say something in the resolutions, but I think we have to deal somehow with ag labor. Given the fact that we were able to take on, but it was after the fact, the ag overtime thing. So, I don't know, Director Orem, do you have your mic down? I didn't know if you had something to say there with that.
Not directly to that, except for I think we do need to come up with some kind of idea to help educate the legislature or the governor's office on the effects and ramifications of such bills. Not that we take a position on it necessarily, but that we just say what the ramifications could be. So.
Oh, what we could do in the newsletter, thank you, Lisa, I get this note here, themes from the panel that we had, that we could do, themes from the panel for a newsletter. But I do think we probably, when we get to our resolution discussion, discuss if we need to do something else from the egg labor piece, whether it be a letter to the governor, whatever it might be. So, okay, so I like the things.
The only other thing I had was a legislative update in the quarterly report. I don't, for our legislative pieces, priorities, if you need.
Yeah, is that helpful?
I'm looking at Jonathan.
Jonathan, did you hear that? So legislative updates on our pieces of legislation to the legislature, is that helpful or is that what? Maybe not? I'm hearing you.
Just an idea.
Okay.
Yeah, to the chair. I think it's based on timing. I think it would be helpful in terms of like maybe just doing like an end of, because this would come at kind of like close to the end of session.
This report's going to hopefully go out within the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
So maybe we wait till the end of session?
I think that
What's
might be
your suggestion?
like, especially around our stuff, I think that might be just like an end of session recap for us, so we can talk about kind of what our legislative approved budget was, what the policy bills that impacted like ODA that passed were, those types of things. And so it's a more comprehensive kind of readout of like, you know, what we're seeing, what we have to implement or change or do, all those types of pieces, rather than kind of like a mid-session update.
Excellent. Okay, so we've got maybe Q3, because the legislature won't adjourn until June 29th. Sorry, I was telling you July, it would be June 29th, and that'll be after our board meeting. So maybe our September report.
Yeah, because then we'd be at least good chunk of the way through our audit, so we'd have
You know, next steps, rules, anything that may come from that. Okay, and then for next time, and that we'll discuss, we'll think about for our June meeting, already on the calendar would be Taste of the States, and also Lower Umatilla groundwater, and then for now, gone. We will have avian flu, Dean Simonich, Chris's update, themes from our panel, and the great idea of upcoming activities. Anything else, Director Lopez?
Miguel Lopez for the record. Chair Miller, I don't think anybody mentioned our visit with the Senate committee. Just us having presented as ODA to that committee. This is a highlight in our newsletter.
Okay.
Just a thought.
And we could do a link and refer back to the recording of that.
Maybe not necessarily the recording, but just the highlight.
I will just say I was very, very proud of our board members who didn't know they were going to be asked to come. They were asked to come up to introduce themselves and speak with. Yeah, they did great. Yes.
I don't know if for this newsletter or the next, but an update on the Farm Bill.
Not this one.
Yeah. Okay. Future. Okay. All right. So Carla, just to make sure, because we're all making our notes and all of that, and I know Lisa's got this too, but can we make sure that that's outlined for us, then we could give to Sherry and make sure we do what we say we're going to do. But now back to the current, and we have 6 minutes till our next speaker. If we do these updates, Dean Simonich, you obviously had provided some information, but I didn't read through everything as far as the federal situation. Whatever you'd feel comfortable, would you mind helping put that piece together? And we probably want to keep it, really brief, but get the point across. Pardon?
So you're giving me guidance on how much to write, or?
Yeah, so Carla, help us, because we've not seen a quarterly report in a couple years, so it's kind of hard to. I can't imagine you want a report that's any more than 1, 2, 3, 4 sides.
I think previously our we probably had about a 4-page total content.
4-page total,
With
okay.
a couple of pictures in it, has been the previous format. We do have a couple of standing columns that are always on the sidebar, which includes our upcoming meeting dates, board meeting dates and locations, a reference back, link back to our resolutions, so people can always go find those documents, and then a link always to our current industry report. So those kind of sidebar things always live on that, and then the total balance of it has been kind of no more than 4 pages total.
I think it's helpful to frame for anybody that's going to try to write something. Are we talking 400 words or 800 words or 1,200 words or whatever? So do you have any words of wisdom if we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 topics that we want to cover, plus the sidebars and the calendar and all that?
I don't have a good word count. I don't live in word count world. I would say no more than a half a page.
Okay.
Per topic.
Okay. All right. Let's look at that.
then
And
we'll
maybe you can give
draft
us a
and
little more
modify from there.
direction. So,
I'm thinking it's 2-3 paragraphs.
okay.
This is just a summary to get their attention, to say, we've touched on this, here's some things that we heard, and if there are questions, they can come back.
Okay.
Otherwise, it will get lost
Yes.
in
Brevity is important.
email
Yeah.
world because it's too much to read at a time. It has to be short, it needs to be concise
Okay.
and on point. And we'll work on a template for it longer term.
Well, definitely, 3 paragraphs is well under 250 words, I think, is probably where we go. We'll give it a try, but see. Okay. All right. Cool. And sorry about the making sausage on that, but we need to get this done. So yes.
Ty Cleaver for the record. Would it be appropriate to put something about the joint memo from the DEQ and the Seafood Processors Association?
Follow up. Yes. The fact that we followed up, we listened and followed up. Yes.
And to have something that's kind of good news in there probably would not be bad.
Yeah. Okay. Lisa, can you do that one? Okay. All right. And that could be really short. So like highlights from actions from last meeting or something could be on each time. So, okay, fun. All right. So Dean, so I'm going to just thank you for taking the Dean. Chris's, I hate to ask staff to do, but maybe I'd be happy to work with you on that, or anybody else want to work with Chris on that section? I'll assign myself just to help. And then we're almost to the time we're going to give a time date. So themes from the panel. Eric, would you like to assist? Maybe Lisa or Jonathan with that? Yes. Okay. Right. And avian flu. I'm kind of... All right, Ellie.
Yeah, if Ellie could work with Lindsay, because that falls into Lindsay's
Ellie and Lindsay.
policy area.
Great. Okay, Elin, Chris, and Ellie and Lindsay for that, for avian flu, and Eric for that, and Lisa and Jonathan. Okay, and upcoming activities you guys can do, right, internally. Okay, so our deadline, because this has been our problem. We say we're going to get it done and we don't get it done. So our deadline could be 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Okay, so 2 weeks puts us at, why don't we say April 15th, just because, well, no, that's way more. So April 1st.
Sure, and then our goal would be to get the newsletter out
by April 15th.
No later than April 15th.
Okay, so April 1, we're going to try to get this accomplished. And because of public meeting laws, the fact that there is only one board member working with a staff person, I think we are perfectly appropriate. So, okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. That was great. Okay, it is now 11 o'clock, and it's time for us to move into our solar panel update. And do we have, oh, there we go. Thank you. I didn't see you come in. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Chair Miller.
All right,
And
so Gordon?
Yes.
And do we have also John and Adam on the line then, or?
They are not available today. They were handling another meeting, so
Okay.
I'll be it today.
Okay, great. We'll turn it over to you, Jordan. We've got 15 minutes. So.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Miller and members of the board. My name is Gordon Howard. I'm the Community Services Division Manager for the Department of Land Conservation and Development in an office one floor below this room here. And I wanted to talk to you this morning about our current efforts to do rulemaking to explore opportunities for renewable photovoltaic solar development in Eastern Oregon while looking for a least conflict or reduced conflict with other attributes protected by our statewide land use planning system, most notably the one that you are most concerned with, agriculture in the state in Eastern Oregon, but also other issues such as wildlife habitat and cultural resources and archaeological resources. Plus, and this all came from a statute the legislature adopted in 2023, House Bill 3409, directing us to do this, to look for a reduced conflict opportunities for renewable solar development in Eastern Oregon, but also to look at how and if we can provide, solar developers can provide community benefits to communities in Eastern Oregon that are hosting these facilities. We started this process. Our Land Conservation Development Commission directed us to begin rulemaking in November 2023, and they appointed a rulemaking advisory committee of over 30 members. I'm not sure about the exact number, but we've had a long and often contentious rulemaking advisory committee process. We've had 5 meetings at various locations in Eastern Oregon, which is defined by the bill as everything east of the crest of the Cascades. It does not include Hood River County, but does include Wasco County. And but however, at the end of this long rulemaking advisory committee process, we have come forward with a draft set of rules on which there is some, at least at this point, general agreement to go forward to our commission for its consideration. Our commission's having a public hearing on the matter next week at its meeting, and then we'll continue to receive public comments into mid-April, and then we'll make a final decision on the rules at its meeting in June, and that's to meet the legislative direction to have the rules in place and written by June 30th of 2025. What we've come up with, I'll try to describe briefly for you, is that for consideration of renewable solar development in Eastern Oregon, and I want to emphasize that the rules are carefully written to not change anything in the area west of the Cascades in the state. We wanted to make sure about that. But for counties in Eastern Oregon, there would be 3 processes that they could consider renewable solar applications. First of all, they could use the existing process. The existing process allows for very small solar developments to be considered. Anything above a very small size, however, requires what's called an exception to statewide planning goal 3, which is the goal protecting farmlands in the state. And goal exceptions, as one famous Land Use Board of Appeals decision said, goal exceptions must be exceptional, and they are difficult to justify, unusual circumstances. And frankly, if anyone, I've been reviewing Land Use Board of Appeals decisions for our commission for the last 12 years, and whenever I see a LUBA decision with the word exception, it's inevitably also includes either the words remanded or reversed, because they are difficult to justify. But the existing methodology is there if someone wants to do that. A county wants to continue to consider those applications. The second method is what was called direct application of our rules. In other words, these rules, draft rules as written now, would allow counties to take the provisions in one provision and directly apply them to consider larger projects without having to approve also a goal exception. And there are, however, some, I'll get into some of the restrictions on that process. And the third method, which counties will always have to also be allowed to do, and which in fact our department and commission would encourage them to do, is to amend their comprehensive plans to develop a custom program for consideration of renewable solar energy facilities within their jurisdiction, and looking once again at competing resource values and how to allow solar development that has the least conflict with those other values. We've come up with dividing, as a base of this, dividing lands in Eastern Oregon into, and almost all the lands we're talking about are agricultural lands. There are some forest lands involved, but it's primarily lands that are protected under statewide planning goal 3 and zoned exclusive farm use. They may be high-value soils with irrigated crops. They may be rangeland. Everything that I'm sure you know much more than I do goes on in agriculture in Eastern Oregon. These rules would divide the lands into three types of lands. First of all, lands where solar development would be encouraged, or encouraged by not having restrictions that apply other areas. They wouldn't have to do a goal exception. They wouldn't have to do any mitigation. And these are generally lands that of non-arable soils, class 7 and 8 rangeland, non-irrigated lands. Then there is a second type of lands where there would be a possibility of allowing renewable solar development, but there would be some mitigation required, and our rules would state, and I'll go over in a bit what that mitigation would be. And then there's a third set of lands where solar development would not be allowed under the new processes provided in these rules. If someone wanted to propose a solar development on, for example, high-value farmland, which is pretty much all in that third category of lands, they would still have to justify an exception to statewide planning goal 3, which would be a very difficult thing for them to do. And we have done some preliminary mapping of these lands. We also have to consider where solar development is feasible from a perspective of the industry in terms of being near transmission lines, of being relatively level land, not over 15% slope, and having enough sun to which almost all of Eastern Oregon, it turns out, does have enough sun, I think, to justify economically a solar facility. But in terms of the specifics regarding agricultural land, we have come up with some rules that do require for that middle category of lands where mitigation is required, what sort of agricultural mitigation would be necessary. And this is something that our program really has not gotten into in the past. So this is new ground for us. So there's another provision in these rules that says after 2 years we'll look at them and see how they're working and make sure that we've done the right thing, and if there's any tweaks or adjustments that have to be made. But for agricultural mitigation, counties could either come up with a program of their own to propose items to mitigate impacts on agricultural lands, or use a calculator in the rule that would allow for payment of mitigation funds to the county or another entity, such as a soil and water conservation district that's designated by the county, which then would use that to promote compensating agricultural activity in that county. The other area we're looking at is called community benefits, and once again, counties could either use a calculator to figure a cash payment or some other customized program for providing community benefits, with the idea that these counties and communities in Eastern Oregon would be hosting solar energy facilities that benefit the whole state. And I think the idea in the legislature when it passed the bill was that these counties should be in some way compensated for their willingness or ability to provide this benefit for the whole state and figure any compensate for any localized impacts on that jurisdiction. We also have included provisions that are kind of carried over from our existing rules for solar development on farmland, which require that if on a particular site, if there are several different types of soils, that are some of more high value than others, that the facility would be located on the less valuable soils, would be required to do that. And I would say also, as I said earlier, that in the three types of lands, pretty much any high value farmland as designated by state law is in the not allowed under the new process category. It's not encouraged or allowed under these provisions to go forward with solar development under these provisions. And also we have included provisions carried over from the existing rule regarding a cumulative impacts analysis. That is, if there's enough solar development to reach a tipping point, if you will, in an area, the county would need to look at any issues and make findings about whether the solar development got to the point where it was significantly negatively impacting agricultural activity in the surrounding area, and what measures, if any, could be taken to mitigate those impacts. And it might be that there were no mitigating impacts and the project couldn't be approved. So, as I said, these rules are in the draft form are going to our commission for a hearing next week, and we expect a lot of public comment. But as I said, after a lot of back and forth and disagreement between the solar industry, farmland advocates, and also there are issues involving wildlife habitat and cultural and archaeological resources and what the tribal governments in Eastern Oregon are interested in. And I think we've come up with a set of rules which will meet the legislature's intent to encourage solar development in Eastern Oregon while reducing or perhaps hopefully even eliminating conflicts to the other resources the state planning program protects, most notably in terms of your concerns, the agricultural economy and agricultural lands of Eastern Oregon. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be open to any questions you might have.
Director Norris?
Ellie Norris for the record. I have a couple of questions, actually. So who is determining the soil type and the arability of the land?
Director Norris, the state, our rules, actually high-value farmland is defined by the state legislature in a statute, and it's based upon the Department of Agriculture soil classifications. And there are some permutations of that. For instance, land with viticultural ability in Eastern Oregon is high-value farmland, even if it isn't the right soil type. And then, let's see, your other question was...
that was just one.
Okay. No, in terms of this one, then our rules define two other categories: arable lands and non-arable lands. And I noticed John Jennings is our community services specialist and expert on a lot of these details, is on remotely, and he might be able to define better than I can what makes up arable versus non-arable soils that are used in the rules. John, do you have anything to say?
Just very quickly, thank you. Appreciate it, Chair Miller and members of the board. As Mr. Howard pointed out, the high-value farmland is defined in statute in a couple areas, and that's really the best of the best, right? That's a prime unique class 1 or class 2 soils, whether irrigated or not irrigated. Then there's some other features about being within an irrigation district or within an AVA. Moving into the arable category, this is something that we really kind of pioneered with the wind rules several years ago, and with help from the Department of Agriculture, and that really is cultivated land, or land it's either undercultivated or that can be cultivated. Right, so this is this is your dryland wheat, other types of things like that. Non-arable is lands that really are not cultivated or can't not be cultivated. Essentially, this is our dryland livestock grazing areas. Thank you.
Yes, Director Norris, I think you had another question.
I do. Thank you. So you mentioned a couple of times a calculator online. Could you just elaborate just a little bit more on what that is?
I'm going to ask John to explain that as well. He's been working extensively on that calculator, which counties would be able to use to determine a mitigation payment.
So thank you, Chair Miller and Director and Mr. Howard. First of all, I'll say that this isn't something we came up with. It's something that was put together by Mr. Mark Hudson with the Oregon Agricultural Trust, who has some background in agricultural economics. What he's done is put together, I think, a pretty clever way to come up with an assessment of the value, potential value that would not be available or no longer be available to the local community through the use of agricultural lands for other purposes. And it has to do with soil types and whether it's a farm or a ranch. There's an efficiency factor and a couple things go into it. And at the end of the day, right, after all these things, you probably end up with a value of somewhere on the high end, maybe $800 to $1,000 an acre. On the low end, much less than that, less than $100 perhaps. And then that is added up and again to recognize and reflect the amount of investment or the dollars that are circulated, dollars that are created by the agricultural operation that would otherwise be circulated locally that won't be anymore. We can provide you an example of that if you'd like. Maybe follow up afterwards. But it's I think it's an interesting approach. It's also one that was suggested based on some of the work in one of the larger projects in Morrow County, the Sunstone Project, that some of you guys may be familiar with. It's not quite as elaborate of a methodology, but it's comparable in terms of final outcome. So I'll stop there. If any other questions, I'll give it a shot. But thank you for your time.
Great, thank you. Additional questions? Yes, Ty.
Ty Cleaver for the record. What is, I guess, the boundary of what's considered a small scale development?
Member Cleaver, Chair Miller, the state legislature, first of all, there's several different answers to that question. The state legislature has set numbers by which a county can consider an application up to 240 acres of high value farmland, 1,928 or 2,560 acres of arable land and 3,840 acres of non-arable land. Anything above that has to be considered by the Energy Facilities Siting Council through their process, working with the Oregon Department of Energy, which is still open and remains unchanged in Eastern Oregon with this proposal. In terms of then, under the current rules, what qualifies for a goal, a small scale in terms of not requiring an exception to statewide planning goal 3 for agricultural lands, it's 12 acres of high value farmland. John, if you could remind me what the numbers are for arable land and non-arable land.
20 for arable and 320 for non-arable.
Okay, so anything below that, I think, would be considered small scale enough under our current rules in Western or Eastern Oregon to, although require certain things to be considered in terms of impacts on agricultural activities around in the area and the agricultural economy. It does not require an exception to statewide planning goal, which is, as I said earlier, a very difficult standard to meet. So that would be, under the current rules, what is small scale. Now, what our rules would do is on these lands that that are not high value farmland or other significant resources, would raise those numbers from 12, 20, and 320 to much higher numbers that still would be able to be considered without taking an exception to the statewide planning goals. And so that's essentially the idea is through this process, looking for the lands that are not as significant for their agricultural abilities or for other issues, wildlife habitat, or having significant archaeological features, and allowing larger projects essentially on those lands under certain conditions still and restrictions, but not requiring the goal exception to statewide planning goal 3.
Hey, thank you for your presentation.
All right. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Director Orem.
Yeah, thank you. Eric Orem, could you expand on the mitigation funds a little bit? Is there, I understand how it's worked. I've been in a couple meetings, but I haven't heard if there's any mitigating money for neighboring landowners that are losing land value or not necessarily access, but just farmability due to the large footprint of these projects?
Director Orem, Chair Miller, John, if you want to add to this, but the idea is that the payment made to the county or their soil and water conservation district, I think that district or the county would have a significant amount of discretion in determining what the best way to mitigate or compensate for the impacts on agriculture in that community are. And John, do you have any thoughts on whether that would include potentially payments to other farmers in the area, or is it more general, do you think?
Well, I thank you for the question, Director Orem and Chair Miller. I think you're right. I think it could. I don't think we have a real set of examples yet of what, but the main thing, I think, the most important thing, right, is that the contribution be received by a county or as was pointed out, another organization that's capable of receiving funds and then reinvesting them in a way that provides some uplift to that agricultural community. It doesn't say what that means or what that has to be, but it does need to be reinvested in ways that help the local agricultural community.
As a follow-up, as a one-time payment to the local businesses and farmers for a project that's going to last 20 or 30 years. I mean, is the mitigation money paid over time? Is it, or what's the plan, I guess, to better understand?
Thank you, Director Orem, Chair Miller. That would be at the discretion of the county. It is a one-time payment at the beginning. The county could, or another organization would have the discretion to figure out how best to use that, whether immediately or over time, to compensate for the impacts. I think that the idea of the rules is that would be we wouldn't be prescribing how the money is spent, other than it's for its general purpose of uplifting the agricultural economy and compensating for the impacts from the facility.
So just my final question, and then so who establishes the tipping point? Is it going to be at the county's discretion, or is that going to be at the state discretion?
Director Orem, Chair Miller, that is whether the mitigation payment is required depends upon, is stated by our rules, which classify the land into those 3 different categories. And if it's in that middle category that requires mitigation, those are the lands where the county would receive the compensation. So that part is fairly set. I think then the question of what the county or other organization does with that money and that compensation is the question that we'll see what happens, but it has to be, it's a fairly discretionary use of the money for the purpose of mitigating the agricultural impacts or compensating the community and uplifting the community.
Oh, no, I understand that. You had mentioned at the very end of your presentation that there is a tipping point, and I guess I take that as a percentage of land in the county, in the said county, or a percentage of acres or percentage of megawatt. I don't know what that tipping point is, and who would determine that tipping point to where it's just. enough is enough in that county.
Okay. Director Orem, that's referring to another provision of the rule, which involving whether there's a concentration in a specific area of the county, and the county would need to make findings about, it's not county-wide. It's even if all the lands in a certain area were the category that said go ahead and allow development on them, at a certain point, the idea is the concentration, and the numbers are set forth in the rule in terms of how many acres of solar development within a certain area. I don't have those off the top of my head, but I can get those to you if you'd like them. But in that situation, that's kind of a different. It's no longer talking about the mitigation money. It's the county looking at specifics of the project in that area, and whether it might be when the county looked at the specifics, the project doesn't have any additional impacts on that part of the county in terms of agricultural activity, and there's no additional findings necessary. Or it might be that the county determines that there are going to be specific impacts of all the, several solar developments in a smaller contained area, and the county would need to see if there were some mitigation measures, perhaps some impacts on travel on roads, or glare from the solar facilities, things like that. And if there were ways to mitigate those specific impacts, and if there weren't, then the county would not approve the project in that particular area.
Thank you.
I know we're running out of time, but this, I think, has piqued a lot of questions, and really appreciate you being here. But Ty, why don't you go ahead, and I'll.
Ty Cleaver for the record. Are the mitigation funds retroactive to already completed projects?
Director Cleaver, no, they are not. This is looking forward only, and so it's projects that would be considered once the rules are effective. So it's not retroactive.
I thank you for being here, and this is a very complex, and for some of us hearing kind of this for the first time, and understanding, next steps and where you're headed. And I think one thing that could be helpful, a lot of times when folks come and do presentations for us, and I know this might have been kind of last minute, so appreciate that. If we could have any kind of a summary of what you had been talking about in writing, I think that would be helpful for us, because I was taking copious notes, and I'm not sure I kept up with everything that you provided. And I had been involved in Iraq about 7 years ago when there was a siting of solar facilities in the Willamette Valley, particularly wine country. And, I think folks had said, oh, well, maybe we should, focus on Eastern Oregon, because that won't be a big deal. Well, I think from what we're hearing from farmers in Eastern Oregon, land prices, implications for a lot of other things is a big deal. And I just, my worry meter has gone up, not down, I have to admit, in this presentation, but I appreciate your charge from the legislature and what you need to focus on doing. But I think we've got to, just, again, a better understanding of it. But it looks like the commission's going to approve the final.
Chair Miller, the question, it's the commission's discretion whether to rules, but they have been directed by the legislature to approve some form of rules by June 30th. So
by June 30th, okay.
And we do have for our commission meeting in March, we do have a very succinct and detailed yet succinct staff report that we can provide you with, that kind of summarizes the issues I've talked about here today.
Okay.
I'd be happy to make that available.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, but they have until June, and so there won't be necessarily a decision in March unless they decide to.
Yeah, Chair Miller, the hearing in March is a public hearing for the commission. Will consider testimony, written and oral, and the public comment period for the rulemaking ends on April 11th, and so then we expect comments after the hearing even, and then the commission at its June meeting will consider all the comments and the staff recommendation and the final recommendation of the Rulemaking Advisory Committee. They have another meeting on April 4th, and then they'll make the final decision in deliberations in June.
Okay, right. Director Lopez?
Yeah, Miguel Lopez for the record. Chair Miller, here on the memorandum page, it does, in section 2 background, it does say that the rulemaking process for public comment has been extended to Friday, April 11th.
Great. Well, thank you. If there's no other questions, appreciate you being here and presenting to us today.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's my first time for the board, and well, actually, it's not. I was here on your agritourism item a few months ago, but that was virtually the first time in person. So.
All right. Well, thank you for being here. Appreciate it. All right. So we will quickly move in and to our board resolutions. And so if we turn to tab 14 and take a look. So by way of background, we've dealt with resolutions in a different way in the past, and we've decided to try to streamline and change that for this year and how we're dealing with various resolutions. We were able to have a very comprehensive focus on the resolutions that were up for review for benefit of our newer members in our December board meeting, and the staff had suggested that there were basically 3 motions that we didn't probably need to even update or change or deal with at all. And so I would be seeking, and just kind of forewarning you, I'd be seeking a motion to approve Resolution 281, 301, and 313 based upon that. Now, we could do whatever we want to do, but based upon that. And then the thought would be in preparation for our June meeting, staff has made suggested changes and all that, but we do have some time for some discussion on those other rules. So if anybody says, hey, think about this, think about that, and that could be in consideration. And then we could go ahead and take a look at what those potential revisions are. And Chair Ellen, thank you for joining us. Appreciate that. Suggested changes might be, and post those for public comment in addition, in advance of what those revisions might look like. So that's probably as clear as mud, but I think the first key is whatever we can approve now, move forward on, and then let's look at the rest. So I would entertain a motion to approve Resolution 281, 301, and 313 as presented.
Chair Miller, Miguel Lopez for the record. I'd like to motion for 281, 301, and 313 to be approved.
Okay. Is there a second?
Chair Miller, Ellie Norris, I second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any discussion on just moving those forward, keeping those in place as is, as written? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay?
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you. Thank you, Director Allen. So as we take a look at the other resolutions beyond that, that we're looking at, you've had a chance to look at these. I guess one of the things we had kind of hoped but didn't occur was when we talked about the resolutions in December, would we get some public comment on them, right? And some ideas or revisions or whatever. And definitely the staff had proposed some potential changes or ideas or perspectives on those, but we didn't receive any public comments. So it kind of leaves us in a situation of, okay, well, the thought would be, let's put those out there again, but if there are any comments that the board has right now today, or I think it's appropriate for the board to even think about submitting, go ahead, Director Sharplow-Hanson, yeah.
So hopefully this won't confuse things.
Okay.
An option would be to have staff take the recommendations that have been put forward and we have not received any public comment for, and if the board is comfortable with them, we could do a red line
Absolutely.
of the resolutions and then have them posted with the red line in them for consideration and approval, hopefully, at our June meeting.
Okay.
But that would clean it up.
That would clean it up. And I think you've